I'll never forget the sound my body made when it hit my parents' dining room floor. Christmas dinner. The table was covered with food candles glowing, everyone dressed in their holiday best. And there I was, sprawled on the hardwood like garbage, my crutch in my sister Marissa's hand, her laughter ringing in my ears. "Stop faking it," she sneered, waving my crutch like a trophy. "You're just a leech, always have been." My mother laughed. My father watched with cold, empty eyes. Not one person at that table moved to help me. I was 35 years old, and my own family had just humiliated me in front of everyone. Again. But here's what none of them knew. Standing directly behind them, invited as a neighbor's guest, was Dr. Daniel Hayes, the retired surgeon who had reviewed my case 4 years ago, the man who knew exactly how I got my injury, and the man who had been waiting for this moment longer than any of them could imagine. He stepped forward, placed a hand on my sister's shoulder, and spoke 6 words that drained the color from every face in that room. What happened next would expose 30 years of lies, destroy a family fortune built on fraud, and reveal a conspiracy so dark that by the end my own father would be led away in handcuffs. They thought I was weak. They thought I would never fight back. They were wrong. This is the story of how I lost everything and then took it all back. My name is Shelby Torres. I'm 35 years old, a financial auditor living in Texas, and for most of my life, I believed I was the problem in my family. It took me 3 decades to understand the truth. I wasn't the problem. I was the target. The flight from Houston to my hometown took 3 hours, but the dread had started building days before I even packed my suitcase. Christmas with my family was never about celebration. It was about survival. Every year I told myself this would be the last time, and every year I found myself walking through their front door again, hoping something had changed while knowing nothing ever would. I parked my rental car in the driveway and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The house looked the same as it always had, large, well-maintained, projecting an image of success and stability that had nothing to do with what happened inside. My crutch lay across the passenger seat, a constant reminder of the accident that had changed my body 4 years ago. I had learned to manage with it, to rebuild my life around my limitations. But here in this house, my injury wasn't seen as something I overcame. It was seen as weakness, and my family had never tolerated weakness. I grabbed the crutch and made my way to the front door. My mother opened it before I could knock her smile, already carrying that edge of criticism I knew so well. "Shelby, finally. We were starting to think you weren't coming." She looked me up and down, her gaze pausing on the crutch. "Still using that thing? I thought you'd be better by now." "Nerve damage doesn't work that way, Mom." "Well, come in. Everyone's already here." Everyone meant Marissa, my older sister, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and my father, who would spend the evening watching everything and saying little. It also meant whatever guests my mother had invited to witness our family's performance of normalcy. The dining room was already full when I entered. Marissa sat at the table looking immaculate, her husband beside her, their children nowhere in sight, probably left with a babysitter so the adults could enjoy their evening. My father occupied his usual seat at the head of the table, his expression neutral, his eyes tracking my entrance with an intensity that had always made me uncomfortable. He didn't greet me. He simply watched this way he always watched, as if I were something to be studied rather than loved. "There she is," Marissa said, her voice carrying the false brightness she used when she wanted to wound someone while appearing pleasant. "The prodigal sister returns, still limping along, I see." "Hello, Marissa." Sit down," my mother urged, gesturing to a chair at the far end of the table, the seat farthest from everyone else, the seat that required me to navigate past the entire family with my crutch, knowing they were all watching my slow, careful progress. I made it to my chair without incident and allowed myself a small breath of relief. Perhaps tonight would be manageable. Perhaps they would focus on other topics and leave me alone. I was wrong. Dinner proceeded with the usual rhythm of conversation that excluded me. Discussions of Marissa's successful friends, my parents' social calendar, my father's opinions on matters he considered beneath everyone else's understanding. I ate quietly, answered direct questions with minimal words, and counted the minutes until I could reasonably excuse myself. Then Marissa decided she wasn't getting enough attention. "You know what I don't understand?" she announced, her voice cutting through the table conversation. She was looking directly at me. "How someone can milk an injury for 4 years. 4 years, Shelby. At some point you have to admit you're just using that crutch for sympathy." I felt my face flush. "I'm not using it for sympathy. I need it to walk." "Do you, though?" Marissa stood up and walked toward me with purpose in her stride. Before I could react, she grabbed my crutch and yanked it from my grip. "Let's see how much you really need it." I reached for the table to steady myself, but she had already stepped back, holding my crutch like a trophy. "Marissa, give it back." "Stop faking it," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're just a leech. You've always been a leech, taking and taking while the rest of us actually accomplish something with our lives." My mother laughed. Not nervously, not uncomfortably, genuinely laughed, as though Marissa had told a clever joke at a party. My father said nothing. He simply watched with that same calculating expression, neither amused nor concerned, observing the scene as if taking mental notes. I lost my balance. My hand slipped from the table edge and I fell, hitting the hardwood floor hard enough to send pain shooting through my damaged leg. I lay there for a moment, stunned, staring up at my family. No one moved to help me. No one told Marissa to stop. They just looked at me, their daughter, their sister, lying on the floor at Christmas dinner, and not one of them cared. Then I noticed we weren't alone. 2 men stood near the doorway to the living room guests I hadn't registered when I arrived. One was Mr. Davis, the elderly man who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. He watched my family with an expression of weary resignation, as though he had witnessed this dynamic many times and knew things he had never spoken aloud. The other man was a stranger, tall, distinguished in his early 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that were fixed on me with an intensity I couldn't understand. He moved toward me before anyone else could react, kneeling beside me with surprising urgency. "Let me help you," he said softly, and there was something in his voice, something that sounded almost like grief. He looked at me as though he recognized me, as though this moment meant something to him personally. "I'm Dr. Daniel Hayes. I'm so sorry this happened to you." I let him help me to my feet, confused by his reaction, by the sorrow in his eyes, by the way Mr. Davis watched him with what looked like silent approval. That was the moment I sensed my family wasn't just cruel, they were hiding something. And the stranger who helped me up looked at me as if he had been waiting for this meeting his entire life. Dr. Hayes helped me steady myself, his grip firm but gentle on my arm. I was still processing what had just happened, the cruelty of Marissa's attack, the indifference of my parents, the hard impact of the floor against my body when he turned to face my family. The shift in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The kind, sorrowful man who had knelt beside me transformed into something else entirely. His spine straightened, his jaw set. And when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that silenced every whisper in the room. "Touch her again, I report assault." 6 words. Just 6 words spoken without raising his voice, without any theatrical anger. But the effect was extraordinary. The entire room froze as though someone had pressed pause on a video. My mother's hand stopped halfway to her wineglass. Marissa's smug expression collapsed into something I had never seen on her face before, raw, undisguised fear. Even my father, who prided himself on never showing emotion, went pale. What struck me most was not their surprise at being confronted. It was the specific quality of their fear. They weren't reacting like people caught in an embarrassing moment. They were reacting like people who had been caught before, who had spent years dreading exactly this kind of confrontation, and who suddenly realized their worst nightmare was standing in their dining room, wearing a charcoal suit and speaking with the calm certainty of a man who knew things he shouldn't know. Marissa was the first to attempt recovery. She forced a laugh that came out brittle and unconvincing. "Excuse me, who do you think you are? This is a private family matter, and I don't appreciate some stranger threatening me in my parents' home." Dr. Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Marissa when he responded. His eyes moved slowly across each member of my family, my mother frozen with her social smile dying on her lips, my father whose calculated composure had developed a visible crack, and finally, Marissa herself still clutching my crutch as though she had forgotten she was holding it. "I'm not a stranger to this situation," Dr. Hayes said quietly. And this wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. What I just witnessed constitutes assault against a person with a documented disability. I am a retired surgeon with 40 years of medical practice. My testimony would carry significant weight in any legal proceeding. He paused, and in that pause I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. And this time, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "I'll testify. This time." The words hit me like a physical blow. I watched my family's reaction, searching for any explanation that made sense, and found none. Marissa's face had gone from fearful to ashen. The crutch slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. My mother reached for my father's hand under the table, a gesture of mutual fear I had never witnessed between them. And my father, the man who had spent my entire childhood projecting an image of unshakable control, looked at Dr. Hayes with an expression I could only describe as cornered. This time. What did that mean? What had happened before that required testimony? Why would a retired surgeon I had never met speak as though he had been involved in something connected to my family's past? My mind raced through possibilities, landing inevitably on the event that had changed everything: my accident. 4 years ago, a workplace incident had left me with permanent nerve damage and a life rebuilt around limitations I never chose. I had always accepted the official explanation: equipment failure, unfortunate timing, a terrible accident that could have happened to anyone. But standing in my parents' dining room, watching their inexplicable terror at 6 words from a stranger, I began to wonder if I had accepted a lie. The silence stretched unbearably. No one seemed willing to speak, as though any word might detonate something they had spent years keeping buried. Finally, my father cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority. "Dr. Hayes, I'm not sure what you think you know, but I assure you this is simply a family disagreement that got out of hand. There's no need for anyone to involve outside authorities in a minor holiday squabble." "Minor," Dr. Hayes repeated, and for the first time I heard anger beneath his controlled exterior. "You watched your daughter fall to the floor. You did nothing. You said nothing. And now you want to characterize this as minor." My mother attempted intervention with her most gracious hostess voice, though it trembled at the edges. "Perhaps we should all sit down and have some coffee. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Dr. Hayes, you're Mr. Davis's guest, and we certainly don't want any unpleasantness to ruin the evening." "The evening was ruined," Dr. Hayes replied, "the moment your daughter assaulted Shelby in front of witnesses. The only question now is what happens next." I had been so focused on Dr. Hayes and my family that I had almost forgotten Mr. Davis was still in the room. When I turned to look at him, I found him watching the scene with an expression that confused me. He didn't look shocked or uncomfortable the way a normal guest would look when witnessing a family confrontation. He looked resigned, tired, like a man who had been waiting years for a storm to break and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Our eyes met across the room. Mr. Davis had known my grandmother before she passed away 5 years ago. He had been our neighbor for decades, present at countless family gatherings, a quiet witness to dynamics I had always assumed were private. Now, looking at his weathered face, I realized he had seen far more than I ever knew. He had watched, he had listened, and he had kept secrets that were only now beginning to surface. He gave me an almost imperceptible nod. It was subtle enough that no one else noticed, but its meaning was clear. Yes, there is more. The truth is coming. My head was spinning. 20 minutes ago, I had walked into this house expecting nothing more than another painful holiday dinner. Now I stood in the wreckage of something I didn't understand, surrounded by family members who suddenly looked like strangers hiding behind familiar faces. Marissa finally broke the silence. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual venom. "I don't know what this man thinks he knows, but he's clearly confused. Shelby, tell him this is just how we joke around. Tell him you're fine." Everyone looked at me, my family expecting me to smooth things over the way I always had. Dr. Hayes watching me with that strange mixture of sorrow and determination. Mr. Davis waiting to see what I would choose. For once in my life, I didn't apologize. I didn't minimize. I didn't make excuses for people who had never made excuses for hurting me. "I'm not fine," I said quietly. "And I don't think this is a joke." Why would a retired surgeon say "this time"? And why did my family look more terrified of those words than any threat of police? The rest of Christmas dinner dissolved into awkward silence and hastily made excuses. My parents retreated to the kitchen. Marissa and her husband left without saying goodbye. I found myself standing on the front porch with Dr. Hayes and Mr. Davis, the cold December air sharp against my flushed cheeks, my mind churning with questions I didn't know how to ask. Dr. Hayes insisted on walking me to my rental car, his concern evident in every careful step he took beside me. Mr. Davis watched us go with that same knowing expression, then quietly disappeared into his own house next door. When we reached the car, I expected Dr. Hayes to say goodnight and leave. Instead, he paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel both seen and exposed. "Shelby," he said gently, "I know you have questions. I can see them in your eyes. I'm not able to answer all of them tonight, but I want you to know something. What happened to you 4 years ago has never sat right with me. I've spent a long time waiting for the right moment to say that." Then he handed me his card and walked away, leaving me alone with 4 years of memories I had tried very hard not to examine too closely. I didn't drive back to my hotel immediately. I sat in the parked car engine, running heat blasting against the winter chill, and let myself remember. The accident happened at a manufacturing facility where I had been conducting a financial audit. It was supposed to be a routine assignment review. The books interview key personnel, file my report. But the facility required all visitors to tour the production floor as part of their safety orientation, and that tour had changed my life forever. I remembered walking along the elevated catwalk above the machinery, following the safety officer who was explaining various processes I had no real need to understand. The metal grating beneath my feet vibrated with the rhythm of the equipment below. The guardrails seemed sturdy. My harness was properly secured, or so I had been told. And then I was falling. For 4 years I had accepted the official explanation: equipment malfunction, unfortunate timing, a freak accident that could have happened to anyone. The harness clip had failed. The guardrail had given way at exactly the wrong moment. I had landed badly, damaging nerves in my leg that would never fully heal. But sitting in that car after the confrontation with my family, I let myself remember what I had spent years trying to forget. The sensation of pressure against my back in the instant before I fell. Not a push exactly, but something. The unnatural angle of my body as I went over, not the flailing tumble of someone who loses their balance, but the directed trajectory of someone who was helped along. The way my harness clip had failed so cleanly, as though it had been tampered with rather than simply worn out. I had mentioned these concerns to my family during my recovery. My mother had dismissed them as trauma-induced confusion. Marissa had accused me of being dramatic, and my father had sat beside my hospital bed, held my hand, and spoken with what I believed was genuine compassion. "Your mind is playing tricks on you," he had said. "It's common after accidents. People look for explanations that aren't there. The investigation found equipment failure. That's the answer. Dwelling on conspiracy theories will only slow your healing." I had trusted him. I had trusted all of them. Now I sat in my rental car and forced myself to examine memories I had deliberately avoided. My father had been unusually insistent that I accept that particular auditing assignment. I remembered hesitating when I first saw the job description. The manufacturing facility had a complex production floor, and something about it made me uneasy. But my father had pushed. "It's a great opportunity," he had said. "The client specifically requested you. Don't overthink it. I took the job. 2 weeks later, I was falling from a catwalk. After the accident, when I was still in the hospital struggling to understand why my leg wouldn't work properly anymore, I had wanted to pursue legal action against the company. The equipment failure seemed like clear negligence. A lawsuit could have meant compensation investigation answers. But once again, my father had intervened. Lawsuits are expensive and stressful, he told me. They drag on for years, and in the end, you might not win anything. The company is offering a settlement. Take it. Focus on healing. Let this go. I took the settlement. I let it go. I moved to Texas partly to start over, partly to put distance between myself and a family that had always made me feel inadequate. I told myself I was moving forward. I didn't realize I was running from questions I should have been asking. Dr. Hayes's words echoed in my mind. This time, I'll testify. What did he know? How was he connected to my accident? Why had he looked at me with such sorrow as though he had been carrying guilt about something for years? I pulled out his card and stared at the phone number. Before I could talk myself out of it, I called him. He answered on the second ring as though he had been waiting. Dr. Hayes, I need to know what you meant tonight. About testifying. About this time. I need to understand. There was a long pause. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Shelby, 4 years ago, I was working as a consulting physician at the hospital where you were treated. I reviewed your case as part of a standard consultation process. Your injuries were severe and something about them troubled me. My hand tightened on the phone. Troubled you how? The damage patterns, he said slowly, were more consistent with external force than with an accidental fall. The way your body impacted the ground, the specific injuries you sustained, they suggested you didn't simply fall. They suggested you were pushed and pushed with intention. The world outside my car window seemed to blur. That's impossible. The investigation said, the investigation was inadequate. I wanted to look deeper to request additional analysis, but I was told it was unnecessary. Someone in your family contacted the hospital administrator and insisted that further investigation would only traumatize you. They said you were fragile, that you needed to focus on recovery, that pursuing questions would damage your mental health. The inquiry was closed. I couldn't breathe. Who contacted the hospital? I don't know for certain. The communication came through official channels, and the family member's name was not disclosed to me. But Shelby, I've spent 4 years watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to tell you that your accident never made sense to me. What I saw tonight confirmed what I always suspected: your family is hiding something, and I believe it's connected to what happened to you. If my accident wasn't accidental, then someone in my own family had wanted me broken. The only question was, who gave the order? I returned to Texas 2 days after Christmas, but I couldn't return to my normal life. Dr. Hayes's words had planted seeds of doubt that grew into something I couldn't ignore. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's calculating expression, my mother's nervous laughter, Marissa's fear when those 6 words were spoken. I kept replaying the accident in my mind, searching for details I had suppressed, trying to separate genuine memories from trauma-induced confusion. By the 3rd sleepless night, I made a decision. If my family was hiding something, I had the skills to find it. I hadn't spent 15 years as a financial auditor without learning how to follow money trace patterns and uncover truths that people desperately wanted to keep buried. I started with publicly available records, property transactions, business filings, court documents, anything connected to my family's name. I expected to find the usual problems that plague small family businesses. Poor management, accumulated debt, bad investments made with more optimism than strategy. What I found instead made my blood run cold. The patterns didn't suggest incompetence. They suggested intention. My family's construction business had been struggling for years, according to the documents. That much was consistent with what I had observed during my occasional visits home: the worried conversations, the belt tightening, the subtle signs of financial stress. But the records told a different story than simple misfortune. Loans had been taken out at suspicious times, always coinciding with significant family events. Shell companies appeared in the filings with no apparent purpose, receiving transfers and then dissolving within months. Money flowed through a maze of accounts designed not to grow wealth but to hide it. I spent an entire weekend mapping the financial structure using skills I had honed over years of professional investigations. By Sunday evening, I had uncovered something that made my hands shake as I reviewed the documentation. Several loans and credit lines were connected to my personal information: my social security number, my former addresses from before I moved to Texas, accounts I had never opened, applications I had never signed, debt I had never incurred. The signatures on these documents looked similar to mine, close enough to fool a casual observer, but they weren't exact matches. Someone had been forging my signature systematically for years, and they had gotten better at it over time. I traced where the money from these fraudulent accounts had gone. A significant portion funded Marissa's lifestyle: the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the expensive vacations she posted on social media, while I lived modestly in my Texas apartment. Another portion covered losses in my parents' failing business ventures, plugging holes that should have sunk the company years ago. The rest disappeared into unexplained cash withdrawals totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over nearly a decade. They had been stealing from me. My own family had been using my identity to fund their lives, while I struggled to rebuild mine after the accident. Every time I felt guilty for not being more successful, for not contributing more to the family, they were draining accounts opened in my name without my knowledge or consent. But the most disturbing discovery was how recent the fraud was. I had assumed when I first started finding these records that the identity theft might have stopped after I moved to Texas. Distance should have made it harder to maintain the deception. Instead, I found a new loan opened under my name just 6 months ago. The forgery was more sophisticated than earlier attempts, the amount larger than previous frauds. They weren't slowing down. They were escalating. As I dug deeper into the financial records, another pattern emerged that challenged everything I thought I knew about my family's dynamics. My father had always presented himself as the quiet one, the passive partner who let my mother make household decisions while he focused on the business. Growing up, I had accepted this division without question. My mother was loud and controlling. My father was reserved and uninvolved. That was simply how they operated. The financial records told a completely different story. Every significant withdrawal traced back to accounts my father controlled. Every strategic loan bore his authorization. Every suspicious transfer originated from decisions he had made, not my mother. The shell companies were registered to addresses connected to his side of the family. The fraudulent applications using my identity contained details that only someone with intimate knowledge of both my personal information and the family business could have provided. My father wasn't passive. He had never been passive. The quiet, detached demeanor I had observed my entire life wasn't the behavior of a man who let others take charge. It was camouflage. A calculated persona designed to deflect suspicion while he orchestrated everything from the shadows. The family business was near bankruptcy. That part was true. But the money hadn't simply disappeared through bad luck or poor management. It had been deliberately extracted, moved through layers of accounts and shell companies hidden somewhere that the records I could access wouldn't reveal. Someone had been systematically draining the company while maintaining the appearance of struggling legitimacy. I sat back from my computer, overwhelmed by what I had uncovered. The father I thought I knew, distant but harmless, uninvolved, but not malicious, had never existed. In his place was someone far more dangerous, a man who planned, who calculated, who used his family members like pieces on a chessboard. My mother's cruelty and Marissa's viciousness suddenly seemed less like personality flaws and more like learned behaviors, patterns established by someone who had been controlling the family's direction all along. I was about to close my laptop when one final document caught my eye. A transfer I had almost overlooked buried among hundreds of other transactions. The date made me freeze. It was exactly 1 week before my accident. A large sum, $50,000, had been transferred from the family business account to a numbered account I had never seen before. The authorization signature was my father's. The recipient account was untraceable through the databases I could access, and the timing was impossible to ignore. 1 week before someone pushed me off a catwalk and changed my life forever, my father had moved $50,000 to an unknown destination. And then Shelby found a transaction dated exactly 1 week before her accident, a large sum transferred to an account she had never seen before. The mysterious transaction haunted me for days. $50,000 moved 1 week before my accident sent to an account that seemed to exist in shadows. I couldn't prove anything yet, but the timing felt like a confession written in numbers, a language I understood better than most. I expanded my investigation beyond the family business, searching for anything that might explain where the money had gone and why. That search led me somewhere unexpected to my grandmother Eleanor, who had passed away 5 years ago, 1 year before my accident changed everything. I had always loved my grandmother. She was the one person in my family who seemed to see me clearly, who valued my quiet determination rather than dismissing it as weakness. When she died, I grieved not just for her loss, but for the loss of the only family member who had ever made me feel truly accepted. I had assumed her estate was handled normally, distributed according to her will, divided among her descendants, processed through the usual legal channels. I was wrong. The deeper I dug into financial records connected to my grandmother's name, the more confused I became. Eleanor Torres had been a careful woman, meticulous about money in ways that reflected her generation's hard-won wisdom about security and independence. She had accumulated substantial assets over her lifetime, property she had inherited, and maintained investments she had managed conservatively, but effectively savings accounts that grew steadily through decades of disciplined habits. By the time of her death, her estate should have been significant enough to require careful documentation and transparent distribution. Instead, I found gaps. Accounts that appeared in records from 7 years ago had vanished by the time of her death. Property transfers occurred in the months before she passed, moving assets into trusts and holding companies that dissolved almost immediately afterward. And buried in the legal filings, I found something that made my heart stop: a private fund, established 12 years ago, explicitly designated for what the documents described as the grandchild who demonstrates integrity rather than entitlement. I read those words 3 times, trying to absorb their implications. My grandmother had created a fund specifically for someone who showed integrity. She had used language that deliberately excluded entitlement, the defining characteristic of Marissa's entire personality. This wasn't a neutral estate provision. This was a message. My grandmother had known exactly what kind of people her son and his family were becoming, and she had tried to protect something for the grandchild she believed deserved it. The fund had contained substantial assets, property deeds, investment accounts, decades of accumulated savings. By the time my grandmother died, the total value exceeded what I would have imagined possible from a woman who lived modestly and never displayed obvious wealth. She had been building something in secret, preparing a legacy that would bypass the greed she clearly saw developing in her own family. All of it had vanished within weeks of her death. The records showed transfers, liquidations, account closures, all executed with signatures that purported to be authorized by the estate's executor. My father had served as executor. Every document that dismantled my grandmother's carefully prepared legacy bore his authorization, his decisions, his control. The fund meant for the grandchild who demonstrates integrity had been absorbed into the family's general finances, its existence erased from any records that might have reached me. A memory surfaced unbidden and suddenly sharp. My grandmother's voice speaking to me during one of our private conversations in the final year of her life. I had visited her alone without my parents or Marissa, and she had taken my hand with surprising strength for a woman her age. "You have my strength, Shelby," she had said. Her eyes locked on mine with an intensity I didn't fully understand at the time. The real Torres strength, not the loud kind that needs everyone to see it, the quiet kind that endures when everything else falls apart. Remember that. You have what the others don't. I had interpreted her words as encouragement, the kind of loving reassurance grandmothers offer to grandchildren who feel overshadowed by more confident siblings. Now I understood she had been telling me something far more specific. She had been saying I was different from the rest of the family, not just in personality, but in a fundamental way that made me the only one she trusted. She had been preparing me to hear this truth someday, planting seeds of understanding she hoped would bloom when I finally discovered what she had intended to leave me. The timeline assembled itself in my mind with terrible clarity. 5 years ago, my grandmother died, and her hidden fund was immediately seized by my father. 1 year later, my accident left me physically broken and financially dependent on a settlement that barely covered my medical expenses. The sequence wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. If my grandmother's fund had been meant for me, then my existence represented a threat to everyone who had stolen it. If I ever recovered enough to investigate, if I ever developed the resources and stability to ask questions, I might uncover what they had done. The inheritance they had taken wasn't legally theirs. Forged signatures and fraudulent documents could be exposed. Criminal charges could be filed. Everything they had built on my grandmother's stolen legacy could collapse. My accident made sudden horrible sense. It wasn't just about the insurance payout or preventing me from investigating their financial crimes. It was about neutralizing me permanently. A broken body, chronic pain, limited mobility, diminished career prospects. These weren't unfortunate consequences of workplace negligence. They were deliberate outcomes designed to ensure I would never have the strength, resources, or stability to discover the truth about my grandmother's inheritance. They had stolen my legacy and then tried to destroy me to protect that theft. I thought about calling Dr. Hayes or Mr. Davis, but something stopped me. Mr. Davis had said something at Christmas that I hadn't fully processed at the time, words spoken quietly, as I was leaving the disaster of that dinner. "Your grandmother knew this would happen, Shelby. She prepared for it." I had been too overwhelmed to ask what he meant. Now his words echoed in my mind with new significance. My grandmother had known. She had seen what her son was becoming, what her granddaughter Marissa had already become. She had tried to protect me through the fund, and when that protection was stolen, she had prepared something else. A backup plan. Evidence. Something that would help me fight back when the time came. Mr. Davis's words echoed in my mind. Your grandmother knew this would happen. She prepared for it. But prepared how and where was the evidence she left behind? I called Mr. Davis the next morning. My hands trembled as I held the phone, my mind racing with questions I had carried for days. When he answered, his voice sounded tired, as though he had been expecting this call and dreading it in equal measure. "Shelby," he said before I could speak, "I've been wondering when you would reach out. I think it's time we had a proper conversation. Can you come to my house this afternoon?" I booked a flight back to my hometown that same day. Mr. Davis lived in the same modest house he had occupied for over 40 years, right next door to the home where I had grown up. I had passed his property countless times as a child, waved to him during summer afternoons, accepted cookies from his wife before she passed away. He had always been a quiet, steady presence, someone who watched without intruding, who knew things without speaking them. Now I understood that his silence had been a burden he carried for years. He welcomed me into his living room, offered me tea I couldn't drink, and sat across from me with the heaviness of a man about to unload a weight he had borne too long. "I should have told you sooner," he began, his weathered hands clasped together. "I've made excuses to myself for 5 years, told myself it wasn't my place, that I didn't have proof that your family would retaliate if I interfered. But watching what happened at Christmas, seeing how they treated you, I can't stay silent anymore. Your grandmother would never forgive me if I did." He took a deep breath and continued. "Around the time Eleanor passed away, I overheard things. Arguments between your parents and Marissa, conversations they had in their backyard, without realizing how clearly sound carries between our properties. They thought they were being private. They weren't." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "What did you hear?" "Phrases, fragments. Enough to understand what they were planning, Even if I didn't have the full picture. Mr. Davis's voice grew heavy with remembered disgust. Your father said, "We need that money now. The business can't survive another quarter without it." Your mother said something about timing, about acting before legal complications arose. And Marissa... He paused, his expression darkening. Marissa said, Shelby won't fight back. She never does. Just get it done before she asks questions. The words hit me like physical blows. My own sister discussing me as an obstacle to be managed. My parents planning to steal what my grandmother had left me. All of them assuming I was too weak, too passive, too beaten down to ever discover the truth. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Because I had no proof beyond what I heard. Because your family has influence in this community, and I was afraid of what they might do. Because... He looked away, shame evident in every line of his face. Because I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting your grandmother's memory by staying out of family disputes. But the truth is, I failed you. I failed Eleanor. He rose slowly and walked to an antique desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer he withdrew a large manila envelope yellowed with age, but clearly preserved with care. Your grandmother gave me this 7 years ago, 2 years before she died. She made me promise to keep it safe and to give it to you only under specific circumstances. He handed me the envelope with something like reverence. Her exact words were, "Give this to Shelby if she is ever harmed or betrayed by those who should protect her." The phrasing sent chills down my spine. Not if something happens to her. Not if she needs help. If she is harmed or betrayed by those who should protect her. My grandmother had known. She had seen the capacity for cruelty in her own son and his family, and she had prepared for the possibility that they would eventually turn that cruelty toward me. She talked about you often in her final years, Mr. Davis continued. She worried about you constantly. She said you were the only one with integrity, the only one she could trust with what she had built. She also mentioned that there were only 2 people in the world she trusted completely, me and... He hesitated as if weighing whether to continue. And who? I pressed. A man she loved long before your grandfather. She didn't give me his name, but she said he would protect you if anything happened. She said he had promised her. Dr. Hayes. It had to be. The connection I had sensed between him and my grandmother's memory suddenly made sense. There was history there, a bond that predated my entire family's existence. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, I found a brief letter in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, a small key, and a slip of paper with an address. The letter read, My dearest Shelby, if you are reading this, my worst fears have come true. I hoped I was wrong about them. I hoped the greed I saw growing in your father and your sister would fade with time, that they would choose love over money, family over ambition. But I prepared for the possibility that they would not. Everything you need to understand and to fight back is waiting for you at the address below. I have gathered documents, records, evidence of things they hope will never come to light. The key opens a storage unit where I have kept my most important personal records, including proof of what I intended to leave you. But be careful, my darling. They may have already tried to destroy what I left behind. Trust no one in the family. Trust only the 2 people I have trusted, Mr. Davis, who is giving you this letter, and the man whose name he will share when the time is right. You have my strength, Shelby, the real Torres strength. Use it. All my love, Grandmother Eleanor. I looked up at Mr. Davis, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. She knew. She knew everything. She was the sharpest woman I ever met, he said softly. Whatever they've done to you, whatever they're hiding, she prepared for it. The answers are waiting for you. I left Mr. Davis's house with the key clutched in my fist and the address memorized. The storage unit was located in a facility on the outskirts of town, a place I had never visited, a secret my grandmother had kept for years. Shelby drove to the storage unit address with trembling hands. But when she arrived, the lock had already been broken. Someone had been there first. I stood in front of the storage unit, staring at the broken lock, feeling something inside me crack along with it. Someone had been here before me. Someone had known about my grandmother's secret preparations and moved to destroy them. The evidence she had gathered, the documents she had preserved, the proof I desperately needed, all of it potentially gone stolen by the same people who had stolen everything else from me. I called Dr. Hayes from the parking lot, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. He listened without interrupting, then spoke with calm authority. "Don't touch anything. Don't go inside. Meet me at the coffee shop on Maple Street in 30 minutes. I can explain what happened." The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived, my mind spinning with questions and fears. Dr. Hayes was already seated in a corner booth, 2 cups of untouched coffee on the table between us. He looked older than he had at Christmas, as though the weight of secrets he carried had aged him overnight. "Sit down, Shelby. We have a lot to discuss." I slid into the booth across from him, my hands still trembling from the shock of the broken lock. "How do you know about the storage unit? How do you know about any of this?" Dr. Hayes took a slow breath before answering. "I've been aware of your situation for longer than you realize. 4 years ago, when you were treated at Memorial Hospital after your accident, I was serving as a consulting physician. I had retired from active surgery by then, but I still reviewed complex cases for the department. Your case was flagged by a former student of mine, the young surgeon who actually performed your operation." "Flagged for what?" "Inconsistencies." His voice was measured, clinical, but I could hear the controlled anger beneath the surface. "The damage patterns in your leg didn't match the official accident report. A simple fall, even from an elevated platform, wouldn't have caused the specific type of nerve damage you sustained. The trajectory, the impact points, the way your body landed, all of it suggested external force. Someone had pushed you, and pushed you with enough strength to ensure serious injury." I felt the blood drain from my face. Dr. Hayes continued. "My student wanted to request additional investigation. So did I. But before we could proceed, we were told the inquiry was unnecessary. A family member had contacted hospital administration insisting that further investigation would traumatize you during your recovery. They said you were fragile, that pursuing questions would damage your mental health. The case was closed before we could gather more evidence. My family did that. The communication came through official channels, and the specific family member's name wasn't disclosed. But yes, someone in your family deliberately prevented us from investigating whether your accident was actually an accident." I thought about my father's calm insistence that I accept the settlement and move on, my mother's dismissal of my fragmented memories, Marissa's contempt whenever I mentioned lingering questions about that day. They had all worked together to ensure I never looked too closely at what had happened to me. "Why do you care?" I asked, the question bursting out before I could stop it. "You didn't know me. You had no connection to my case beyond a routine consultation. Why have you spent 4 years thinking about a stranger's accident?" Dr. Hayes was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality I hadn't heard before, something between sorrow and fierce protectiveness. "I made a promise to someone a long time ago. Someone who worried about you more than you'll ever know." He paused, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Let's leave it at that for now. The details can wait until you're ready to hear them. For now, what matters is that I made a commitment to watch over you, and I intend to honor it." My grandmother. He was talking about my grandmother. The man she had loved before my grandfather, the one she trusted completely, it was him. I wanted to press for more details, but something in his expression told me he would share the full truth only when he believed I was prepared for it. "What about the storage unit?" I asked instead. "Everything my grandmother left for me, is it gone?" Dr. Hayes shook his head, and for the first time since I'd met him, a small smile crossed his face. "Your grandmother was smarter than all of them combined. She knew exactly who she was dealing with." "I don't understand." Eleanor anticipated that someone might try to destroy her evidence. She expected betrayal from her own family, not just suspected it, but planned for it as an inevitability. The storage unit was real, and it contained important items, but the most critical documents were never there. Hope flickered in my chest, fragile but persistent. Where are they? She sent them to her attorney before she died with specific instructions. The documents were to be held in trust and released to you only under certain conditions that have now been met. Marissa broke into that storage unit approximately 1 month after your grandmother's funeral, desperate to destroy whatever evidence Eleanor had gathered. She found personal belongings, old photographs, sentimental items. But the proof of the inheritance fund, the records of financial manipulation, the evidence of your father's involvement in the family's crimes, all of it was already safely stored with a lawyer who has been waiting for you to come forward. I sat back in the booth, overwhelmed by the complexity of what my grandmother had prepared. She had known. She had seen everything coming: the theft, the betrayal, perhaps even my accident. And she had built a fortress of evidence to protect me from beyond the grave. The attorney's name is Margaret Chen, Dr. Hayes continued. I can arrange a meeting whenever you're ready. She has everything Eleanor gathered: financial records, private investigator reports, even recordings. Your family has no idea the real evidence still exists. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, a gesture that felt paternal rather than presumptuous. I know this is overwhelming. I know you're still processing what your family has done to you, but I want you to understand something: you're not alone in this. Your grandmother made sure of that. She arranged for people who would stand beside you when the truth finally came out. You have allies, Shelby. You have resources. And you have the strength to see this through. I looked at this man who had appeared in my life so suddenly, who carried secrets about my grandmother and my past, who had been watching over me for years without my knowledge. I should have felt suspicious. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: protected. Then Dr. Hayes asked the question that would change everything. Shelby, now that you know what they've done, what do you want to do about it? Dr. Hayes's question echoed in my mind for days after our meeting. What did I want to do about it? For so long I had been the victim, the overlooked daughter, the mocked sister, the broken woman who couldn't even walk without assistance. My family had spent decades training me to accept mistreatment as normal, to doubt my own perceptions, to believe I deserved less than everyone else. But something had shifted inside me. The woman who left that coffee shop was not the same person who had fallen to the floor at Christmas dinner. I returned to Texas and spent 3 days in near isolation, barely eating, hardly sleeping, letting my mind work through everything I had learned. By the 4th morning, I had made my decision. I didn't just want answers. I wanted justice. And I was going to design it myself. My approach would be strategic and comprehensive, built on the professional skills I had developed over 15 years as a financial auditor. I knew how to trace money, uncover fraud, and build cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. I had spent my career helping corporations expose internal theft and manipulation. Now I would use those same abilities against the people who had stolen from me. I divided my plan into 2 distinct phases. The first was emotional justice, forcing my family to confront the full weight of their cruelty and manipulation. They had operated for years under the assumption that their behavior would never have consequences, that I would remain silent and compliant forever. I wanted to shatter that assumption. I wanted them to look into my eyes and understand that I knew everything, that their secrets were no longer safe, that the daughter they had dismissed as weak had become their greatest threat. The second phase was legal justice, exposing the fraud, reclaiming what had been stolen, and ensuring they faced real consequences for their crimes. Identity theft, forgery, inheritance fraud, possibly conspiracy to cause bodily harm. The charges could be devastating if I built my case correctly. I wanted them to lose the things they valued most: their money, their reputation, their power over me, and most importantly, their ability to hurt anyone else ever again. I began by mapping out each family member's specific vulnerabilities. My mother cared obsessively about social standing and community perception. She had built her entire identity around being seen as a successful wife, a devoted mother, a pillar of local society. The reality of her participation in fraud and abuse would destroy everything she had worked to project. Her weakness was her need for external validation, her terror of being judged by the neighbors she spent so much energy impressing. My father presented a different challenge. His quiet facade had fooled me for years, but I now understood that his true nature was calculating and controlling. He valued his image as the wise patriarch, the steady hand guiding the family through difficulties. He needed to believe he was the smartest person in any room, the one pulling strings, while others remained oblivious. His weakness was his arrogance, his certainty that no one, especially not his damaged daughter, could ever outmaneuver him. Marissa was perhaps the easiest to analyze. Her entire identity revolved around appearances, luxury, and being seen as superior. She needed designer clothes, expensive vacations, the visible markers of success that allowed her to look down on everyone else, especially me. Strip away her access to money, expose the fraudulent foundation of her lifestyle, and she would collapse. Her weakness was her complete dependence on stolen wealth to maintain her sense of self-worth. I would strike each vulnerability systematically, letting the pressure build until their carefully constructed lies collapsed under their own weight. But first, I needed evidence, irrefutable, documented, legally admissible evidence. I met with Margaret Chen, my grandmother's attorney, at her office in downtown Houston. She was a sharp woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had been waiting 5 years for me to walk through her door holding documents my grandmother had entrusted to her with instructions that now felt prophetic. The materials Eleanor had gathered were extensive. Financial records showing the systematic draining of her estate. Private investigator reports documenting suspicious transfers and shell company activities. Copies of the original inheritance fund documents proving the fund had existed and had been designated for me. Even recordings, audio files of conversations my grandmother had with Marissa, conversations that revealed far more than my sister had ever intended to share. I added my own research to the collection. Bank statements showing fraudulent accounts opened under my identity, complete with forged signatures. Side-by-side comparisons of my authentic signature next to the fakes prepared with the expertise of a handwriting analyst I hired through professional contacts. Records of suspicious transfers connected to the family business tracing hundreds of thousands of dollars through accounts designed to obscure their origins and destinations. Most importantly, I assembled the timeline. The sequence of events that connected financial crimes to my accident 4 years ago. The mysterious $50,000 transfer 1 week before I fell. The insurance payout that conveniently covered business losses. The pattern of fraud that intensified after my injury left me too broken to investigate. Every piece fit together, forming a picture of deliberate, coordinated betrayal. I worked for weeks organizing materials, cross-referencing documents, building a case that would withstand scrutiny from attorneys and investigators. Dr. Hayes helped me understand the medical evidence. Margaret Chen guided me through the legal implications. Mr. Davis provided testimony about what he had witnessed and overheard. For the first time in years, I wasn't working alone, and for the first time since my accident, I felt powerful rather than powerless. The helplessness that had defined my life for so long began to lift, replaced by something stronger purpose. I had been their victim, but I would not remain their victim. I had the intelligence, the resources, and the determination to hold them accountable. They had underestimated me my entire life. That mistake was about to cost them everything. My plan was nearly complete. I had scheduled a family meeting for the following week, ostensibly to help with their financial troubles. In reality, I would walk into that meeting with evidence that would destroy their comfortable assumptions forever. I was ready. Then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach tighten. It was my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Shelby. Her voice was thick with tears, panicked in a way I had never heard before. Shelby, please, you have to help us. The bank is threatening foreclosure. The business accounts are frozen. We're about to lose everything, the house, the company, all of it." She sobbed into the phone, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "You're the only one who can save us. Please, you have to come home." I didn't go to them. I made them come to me. After my mother's tearful phone call, I waited 2 days before responding. When I finally called back, I kept my voice neutral, professional, and made it clear that if they wanted my help, they would need to fly to Texas and explain the situation in person. I claimed my work schedule made travel impossible. In truth, I wanted them on my territory, away from the house where they had humiliated me, in a space where I controlled the environment. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon, appearing at my apartment door without warning, despite my request that they call first. My mother looked haggard, her usual careful makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. My father stood behind her, his expression unreadable, his posture stiff with something that might have been discomfort, or might have been calculation. "Shelby, thank goodness." My mother pushed past me into the apartment, her eyes scanning the modest space with barely concealed judgment, even in her desperation. "We didn't know where else to turn. You're the only one in the family with real financial expertise. We should have recognized that years ago." The praise landed like a slap. For decades, my career had been a source of dismissal and mockery. Marissa's superficial achievements were celebrated while my professional accomplishments were ignored or minimized. Now, suddenly, my expertise was valuable. Now, when they needed something from me, my talents were worth acknowledging. I gestured for them to sit on my small sofa while I took the chair across from them. My phone sat on the coffee table between us, its recording app already running, capturing every word they would say. "Tell me what's happening," I said, keeping my voice carefully sympathetic. My mother launched into an explanation that painted them as victims of circumstance. The business had suffered setbacks. The economy had been difficult. Investments hadn't performed as expected. She used phrases like "unfortunate timing" and "factors beyond our control," constructing a narrative in which no one was responsible for anything. "And Marissa," she added with a sigh, "made some mistakes with the accounts. You know how she is. She means well, but she doesn't have your head for numbers. Some of her decisions were not ideal. We need someone who can sort through the mess and help us understand where we stand. Marissa's mistakes, not Marissa's crimes, not systematic fraud and identity theft spanning years. Just mistakes the kind anyone might make, certainly nothing that warranted serious concern or legal consequences." What struck me most was my father's behavior. In every family conversation, I could remember my mother had dominated while he remained in the background, offering occasional comments, but never leading discussions. Now he was different. He sat forward, engaged, interjecting with specific details and explanations that suggested careful preparation. "The core business is still viable," he said, his voice carrying an authority I rarely heard from him. "We need someone to review the accounts, identify where the problems originated, and develop a restructuring plan. Your mother is right, you have skills we've never properly utilized. This could be an opportunity for you to really contribute to the family. An opportunity for me to contribute." As though I had been waiting my entire life for the chance to clean up their crimes and call it family service. "We're not asking you to do this for free," my mother added quickly, misreading my silence as hesitation about compensation. "Once the business is back on its feet, we'll make sure you're properly recognized. You could even have a formal role in the company if you wanted." They were offering me a seat at a table they had spent my entire life excluding me from, but only because they needed my skills to survive. The conditionality of their affection had never been more transparent. When I was struggling after my accident, when I needed support and understanding, they had offered mockery and dismissal. Now that they were struggling, they expected me to rush to their rescue without question. I let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. "I need to understand the full scope of the problem before I can help," I finally said. "That means complete access to all financial records. Bank statements, tax returns, business accounts, personal accounts, everything. I can't work with partial information." My parents exchanged a glance. Something passed between them, some silent communication I couldn't interpret. "Of course," my father said smoothly. "We'll give you whatever you need. We have nothing to hide. This is just a family going through difficult times looking for a way forward together." Family matters stay inside the family. He didn't say it explicitly, but the message was clear. Whatever I found, whatever I learned, was expected to remain private. They wanted me to discover their crimes and then help them cover up the evidence, all in the name of family loyalty. I agreed to help. I told them I would need a few weeks to review everything, that I would come back to visit and go through the records in person, that I would do my best to find a solution that protected everyone. I played the role of the dutiful daughter, the forgiving sister, the capable professional, eager to serve her family's needs. They believed me. Of course they did. They had spent my entire life teaching me to be compliant, to accept mistreatment without complaint, to prioritize their needs over my own well-being. It never occurred to them that I might have learned a different lesson, that their cruelty had finally taught me how to protect myself, by letting them see exactly what they expected to see. My mother hugged me before they left, her embrace tight with relief, and something that might have been genuine affection, though I no longer trusted myself to tell the difference. My father shook my hand formally, thanking me for agreeing to help. As they walked toward their rental car, I stood in my doorway watching them go. My mother was already on her phone, probably calling Marissa to share the good news that Shelby had agreed to fix everything. She didn't look back, but my father did. He turned at the car door and looked at me across the parking lot. The expression on his face was nothing like gratitude. His eyes were narrowed, assessing, calculating. For just a moment, the mask of the passive, uninvolved father slipped away completely, and I saw something cold underneath. He was studying me the way he had studied me at Christmas dinner, not as a daughter, but as a variable in an equation he was constantly solving. As her parents left, relieved and grateful, Shelby noticed her father watching her with an expression she had never seen before. Not gratitude, but something colder, as if he was calculating whether she could still be controlled. The image of my father's cold, calculating stare stayed with me for days after my parents returned home. I had always believed he was the passive one, the quiet observer who let others drive the family's cruelty. Now I understood that his passivity was a performance, a carefully crafted disguise that allowed him to manipulate from the shadows while avoiding accountability. He had looked at me not as a daughter who had agreed to help, but as a potential threat that needed to be assessed and managed. I was still processing that realization when Marissa made her move. The email arrived 3 days after my parents' visit, landing in my inbox late on a Tuesday evening. The subject line read simply, "About your involvement." And I knew before opening it that my sister was about to make a mistake. Marissa had never been able to tolerate anyone else receiving attention or importance within the family. The idea that I, the sister she had spent decades dismissing as worthless, was now being consulted about family finances must have been eating at her since the moment our parents told her about their trip to Texas. I opened the email and began reading. "Shelby." It began without any greeting or pleasantry. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but let me be very clear. You have no business getting involved in family financial matters. You've always been the weak link, the one who couldn't handle responsibility, the one who needed to be taken care of, while the rest of us actually contributed something. The fact that Mom and Dad came crawling to you for help is embarrassing for everyone." The contempt was familiar, the tone identical to every dismissive comment she had ever made about my career, my abilities, my worth as a person. But as I continued reading, my heart began to pound. You have no idea how complicated our situation is. The accounts we set up over the years were necessary to keep the business afloat. The signatures that don't match well enough are a technical problem, not a crime. If you start poking around in things you don't understand, you're going to create problems for everyone, including yourself. Remember what happened last time you started asking too many questions. Remember how that worked out for you. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time, my hands trembling. The accounts we set up. Not accounts that were opened, not accounts that exist. Accounts we set up an admission of active involvement in creating something fraudulent. Signatures that don't match well enough acknowledging that forgery had occurred and the only concern was quality control. And most damning of all, remember what happened last time you started asking too many questions. She was talking about my accident. She was explicitly connecting my injury to my tendency to investigate, to ask questions, to look too closely at things my family wanted to keep hidden. The phrasing revealed everything. Marissa had always known my accident was not accidental. She had known and she had lived with that knowledge for 4 years, and now her arrogance had driven her to reference it in writing. The email continued growing more venomous as Marissa's anger built momentum. "You're trying to ruin everything again, just like you almost did before the accident. You were getting too close to things that were none of your business, asking questions about Grandma's estate, talking about hiring your own lawyer. We handled that situation, and we'll handle this one too if we have to. Stay in your lane, Shelby. Go back to Texas and your pathetic little apartment and your meaningless job. Let the adults in this family manage our own affairs." Let the adults manage. As though I were still a child, still the little sister who could be silenced with mockery and intimidation. As though the woman who had built a successful career uncovering financial fraud could be frightened away by a threatening email. But more importantly, we handled that situation. The casual admission that my accident had been handled, that it was a situation requiring management rather than a tragedy that befell me. And the explicit connection to my questions about my grandmother's estate, confirming that my investigation into the inheritance had been the trigger for whatever they had done to stop me. Marissa had just confessed. Not in a courtroom, not under oath, but in her own words, typed in anger and sent without any thought to the consequences. Her arrogance, born from years of getting away with cruelty, had finally betrayed her. I read the email one more time, forcing myself to absorb every incriminating detail. The forged signatures, the fraudulent accounts, the stolen inheritance, the accident that had been deliberately caused to silence me. Everything I had suspected. Everything Dr. Hayes and Mr. Davis had hinted at, everything my grandmother had prepared for Marissa had confirmed it all because she couldn't resist the urge to assert her dominance one more time. I forwarded the email to Margaret Chen, immediately adding a brief note explaining its significance. Then I saved copies in 3 separate secure locations, my encrypted cloud storage, a USB drive I kept in a safety deposit box, and my personal laptop's protected folder. I printed a hard copy and added it to the physical evidence file I had been building for weeks. The woman who had spent decades making me feel stupid, incompetent, and worthless had just proven herself to be the foolish one. All those years of cruelty, all that confidence in her own superiority, and she had destroyed her own legal defense with a single angry email. She had handed me a written confession because she couldn't tolerate the idea of me being important for even a moment. I sat back in my chair and looked at my evidence file, now thick with documentation. Bank records, forged signatures, financial transfers, medical reports, witness statements, recordings. And now Marissa's email, the thread that tied everything together, the explicit acknowledgement that my family had committed crimes against me and had handled me when I got too close to the truth. The crack in their armor was now wide enough to shatter everything. One email written in rage and arrogance had given me the final piece I needed. Shelby saved the email and smiled for the first time in weeks. Marissa had just handed her the key, but the door it opened led somewhere darker than Shelby ever imagined. Marissa's email changed everything. What had been suspicion was now confirmation. What had been theory was now documented evidence. I spent the following week refining my approach, consulting with Margaret Chen about legal implications, and preparing for what I knew would be the most important confrontation of my life. When I called my mother to announce that I had completed my financial review, my voice carried the same dutiful tone I had used my entire life. I told her I was ready to present my findings and recommendations. I suggested a formal family meeting at their home, explaining that the situation was complex enough to require everyone's presence and focused attention. I could hear the relief flooding through the phone as she agreed, already imagining that her problems were about to be solved by the daughter she had always underestimated. "That's wonderful, Shelby. We knew we could count on you. Should we have Marissa there as well?" "Absolutely. Everyone who has been involved in the family finances should be present. This affects all of us." I scheduled the meeting for the following Saturday. That gave me 5 days to finalize my preparations and ensure that every detail was in place. They expected me to arrive with spreadsheets showing paths to recovery, professional recommendations for restructuring, perhaps gentle suggestions about belt tightening and better management practices. They expected salvation wrapped in sisterly forgiveness. What I prepared instead was an execution. I organized my materials with the same professional precision I brought to every audit I had ever conducted. The evidence was arranged in folders, each one designed to reveal a specific layer of their crimes. The first folder contained financial documents showing the pattern of fraud accounts opened under my identity, forged signatures, the systematic siphoning of money from the family business into personal accounts. Side-by-side comparisons made the forgeries obvious even to someone without my training. The second folder held timeline charts I had created connecting specific crimes to specific family members through dated transactions and documented decisions. The mysterious $50,000 transfer 1 week before my accident. The inheritance fund that vanished within weeks of my grandmother's death. The new loan opened under my name just 6 months ago. Every crime was mapped, every connection illustrated, every attempt at concealment exposed. The third folder contained the audio recordings from my parents' visit to Texas, their own voices admitting to Marissa's mistakes and insisting that family matters stay private. My father's unusually detailed explanations that revealed far more preparation than a passive observer should possess. Their desperation captured in digital clarity forever available for legal proceedings. The fourth folder held Marissa's email printed, annotated, devastating. Her explicit references to the accounts we set up and signatures that don't match well enough. Her casual mention of what happened last time. I asked too many questions. Her arrogant admission that they had handled that situation, meaning my accident, meaning my broken body and shattered life. The fifth folder contained medical reports about my injuries, Dr. Hayes's professional analysis of damage patterns inconsistent with accidental falls, the documentation of deliberate external force, the evidence that someone had pushed me with intent to harm. Alongside these were documents from my grandmother's recovered files, including private investigator reports and recordings that proved Eleanor had known about her family's crimes before she died. Each folder was a weapon. Each piece of evidence was a blade designed to cut through their denials. I would present them methodically, allowing the pressure to build, guiding my family toward confessions they wouldn't realize they were making until it was too late to take back their words. But I needed one more element to ensure success: witnesses. I called Dr. Hayes first, explaining my plan and asking if he would be willing to attend the family meeting as a neutral medical advisor who could help explain the complex aspects of my injuries and recovery. He agreed immediately, his voice carrying grim satisfaction at the prospect of finally confronting the people who had hurt me. Mr. Davis was more hesitant. He had spent years watching my family from next door, carrying guilt for his silence, and the idea of direct confrontation clearly unsettled him. But when I explained that his presence would serve as both moral support and witness protection, he agreed. He owed it to my grandmother, he said. He owed it to me. He would be there. When I informed my mother that Dr. Hayes and Mr. Davis would be attending the meeting as advisors to help explain complex financial and medical issues, her response revealed exactly what I expected. "Is that really necessary? This seems like it should stay within the family." "The situation involves medical documentation related to my accident and potential legal considerations," I said smoothly. "Having neutral professionals present will help ensure everyone understands the full picture. Dr. Hayes can explain the medical aspects, and Mr. Davis has been a family friend for decades. His perspective might be valuable." A long pause. I could practically hear her conferring with my father, their confidence wavering at the introduction of outside observers. They had operated for years under the assumption that no one was watching, that their crimes were invisible to everyone except the victim they had trained to stay silent. "Fine," my mother said finally, her voice tight. "If you think it's necessary." "I do." The day of the meeting arrived gray and cold winter, refusing to release its grip on the landscape. I flew in from Texas that morning, rented a car, and met Dr. Hayes and Mr. Davis at a coffee shop to review our approach one final time. They would sit quietly during the presentation, observing and witnessing, speaking only if I directed questions to them or if my family attempted to intimidate me into silence. We arrived at my parents' house precisely on time. My mother opened the door with a nervous smile, her eyes darting to Dr. Hayes and Mr. Davis with barely concealed anxiety. My father stood in the hallway behind her, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture rigid with tension. Marissa was already seated in the living room, her arms crossed her face, radiating the contempt she had expressed so freely in her email. They had arranged the seating to position me facing all three of them, a subtle attempt at intimidation, the united family confronting the problem child. I ignored their configuration and chose my own seat, placing my briefcase on the coffee table between us. "Thank you all for making time for this," I said, my voice calm and professional. "I know you're expecting recommendations for how to save the business, but before we discuss the future, we need to address the past." The family gathered in the living room, expecting salvation. Shelby opened her briefcase, pulled out the first folder, and watched the color drain from their faces before she said a single word. The first folder lay open on the coffee table, its contents visible to everyone in the room. I watched my family's eyes move across the documents, watched recognition and fear begin to register on their faces. They had expected graphs showing recovery projections. Instead, they saw loan applications bearing my name and signatures I had never written. "Let's start with identity theft," I said, my voice carrying the calm, professional tone I used during every corporate audit. I pulled out the first set of documents, side-by-side comparisons of my authentic signature next to the forgeries that had been used to open fraudulent accounts. These are loan applications submitted under my name over the past 7 years. On the left is my actual signature obtained from tax returns and employment documents. On the right are the signatures used on these applications. I pointed to specific inconsistencies with the precision of an expert witness. Notice the loop on the S is completely different. The angle of the baseline shifts inconsistently. The pressure patterns don't match my natural handwriting at all. These are forgeries, obvious ones to anyone trained to recognize them. My mother's face cycled through expressions I had seen my entire life. First, denial, her mouth opening to protest, then anger when she realized I wasn't going to be easily dismissed, and finally the beginning of tearful deflection. "Shelby, there must be some explanation. Maybe someone stole your information without our knowledge. We would never—" I held up another document. She stopped speaking. "Bank security footage timestamps," I continued. "These records show exactly when and where the loan applications were submitted. This particular application, dated March of 3 years ago, was filed at a bank branch on Oak Street at 2:14 in the afternoon." I produced a second sheet. "And this is Marissa's location data from her phone records for the same day obtained through legal discovery processes. She was within 200 feet of that bank branch at 2:12 in the afternoon." Marissa's composure cracked. "You can't prove—" "There are 17 similar matches across the timeline of fraudulent applications." I spread more documents across the table. "Every single one corresponds to your location, your schedule, your patterns. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to explain how these are all coincidences?" Silence. My mother's tears had begun to fall, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt for causing her distress. She had watched me fall to the floor at Christmas dinner and laughed. Her tears meant nothing to me now. I moved to the next section of documentation, explaining methodically how the family business had reached the brink of bankruptcy. My father shifted in his seat, the first movement he had made since I began. "The official narrative," I said, glancing at him, "is that the business suffered from economic downturns and bad luck. You told me that when you came to Texas begging for help. Factors beyond our control, I believe were the exact words. I pulled out the timeline charts I had spent weeks preparing. The reality is different. Over the past decade, approximately $470,000 was systematically withdrawn from business accounts and transferred to personal holdings. The money didn't disappear due to market conditions. It was deliberately extracted. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Business finances are complex. Sometimes funds need to be moved for legitimate operational reasons. Legitimate operational reasons? I nodded as though considering his point, then produced another document. Like this transfer of $30,000 to a personal investment account made 3 days before a scheduled tax payment that subsequently bounced. Or this withdrawal of $15,000 in cash coded as consulting fees to a company that doesn't exist. Or perhaps you mean the monthly transfers to an account that funded Marissa's luxury car lease while employees were being laid off due to budget constraints. Each document landed on the table like a verdict. I had spent 15 years learning how to trace money through layers of obfuscation, how to identify patterns designed to hide theft, how to build cases that exposed the truth no matter how cleverly it had been concealed. My family had no idea what they were facing. The business didn't fail, I said flatly. It was murdered, deliberately bled dry over years of systematic theft, then left to collapse while the people responsible walked away with hundreds of thousands of dollars they stole from their own company. My father attempted one more deflection. You're misinterpreting business decisions made under pressure. Every choice had context you don't understand. I was ready for this. I produced a series of emails and memos, internal communications that had been preserved in my grandmother's files, evidence she had gathered before she died. Context like these emails discussing how to accelerate the timeline before auditors asked questions. Context like this memo about ensuring the accounts are cleaned before year-end review. Your own words. Dad, your own handwriting on some of these documents. He said nothing. His face remained perfectly still, perfectly composed, revealing nothing at all. Throughout the presentation, I had been observing my family with the clinical detachment of a researcher studying specimens. My mother's emotional journey from denial through anger to tears was exactly what I had predicted her playbook for avoiding accountability deployed reflexively whenever she faced consequences. Marissa had shifted between defensive fury and barely concealed panic, her confidence shattered by evidence she couldn't dismiss or explain away. But my father was different. He sat in absolute stillness, his expression betraying nothing. No shock at being exposed, no guilt at having his crimes documented, no fear of what would come next. He watched me the way he had watched me at Christmas dinner, the way he had watched me from the car when he and my mother left Texas, calculating, assessing, adapting to new information while giving nothing away. That inhuman calm terrified me more than my mother's tears or Marissa's rage. It confirmed what I had begun to suspect during my weeks of investigation. My father was not the passive, uninvolved man he had pretended to be for my entire life. He was the architect of everything, the fraud, the theft perhaps even worse. The quiet demeanor was camouflage. The deference to my mother was performance. Underneath that mask was someone far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Shelby closed the financial folder and set it aside. That covers the money, she said quietly. Now let's talk about what you did to me. And for the first time, she saw real fear in her father's eyes. The fear in my father's eyes lasted only a moment before his mask slid back into place. But I had seen it, that flicker of genuine terror at the words, "What you did to me." He knew exactly what I was about to reveal. He had always known. I set aside the financial documents and opened a different folder. This one contained no spreadsheets or bank statements. It held something far more damaging, a detailed record of emotional destruction spanning 3 decades. The money is only part of what you stole from me, I said, my voice steady despite the memories threatening to overwhelm me. You also stole my sense of worth, my confidence, my ability to believe I deserved love and respect. That theft began long before any fraudulent account was opened. I pulled out a timeline I had created during sleepless nights in Texas, documenting specific instances of cruelty I had spent years trying to forget. October 14th, 1997. My 8th grade science fair. I won second place in the regional competition, the first time any student from our school had placed that high. You promised you would come to the award ceremony. Instead, you drove Marissa to a cheerleading tryout 2 counties away. When I asked why, you said her activities were more important because she had real potential. My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could speak. June 6th, 2003. My college graduation. I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in accounting. You arrived late, left early, and spent the entire reception talking about Marissa's engagement announcement. You never once said you were proud of me. When I asked later if you had noticed my honors cord, you said I was making a big deal out of nothing. The specific dates, the precise details, the documented pattern, each example landed with the weight of accumulated evidence. I had kept these memories buried for years, dismissing them as sensitivity or misremembering. Now I presented them as what they were: proof of systematic emotional neglect. December 25th, 2019, Christmas dinner. I arrived despite knowing I would be mocked for my injury. Marissa grabbed my crutch and called me a leech. I looked at my mother, laughed while I lay on the floor. None of you helped me up. A stranger had to do what my own family refused to do. My mother's tears had resumed, but her voice carried defensiveness rather than remorse. Shelby, you're being too sensitive. Families tease each other. We never meant to hurt you. We did our best with what we knew. You always took things too personally. Too sensitive. The phrase I had heard my entire life deployed whenever my pain became inconvenient for the people causing it. Did you do your best? I asked quietly. Let me play something for you. I pulled out my phone and pressed play on a recording from Christmas dinner audio I had captured without their knowledge, legal in this state as a single-party consent jurisdiction. My mother's laughter filled the room, followed by Marissa's mocking voice. Look at her down there. Pathetic. She's been milking that injury for years. Then my father's measured tone. She's always been the weak one. Some people just aren't built for success. The recording continued, capturing every cruel comment, every dismissive laugh, every moment of humiliation they had inflicted while I lay on the floor. I watched their faces as they heard their own voices. The ugliness they had convinced themselves was harmless family teasing, now preserved in undeniable clarity. When the recording ended, silence filled the room. My mother had stopped crying. Marissa stared at the floor, her earlier defiance crumbling. Even my father's composure seemed shaken, though, whether from guilt or merely the realization that evidence existed, I couldn't tell. Dr. Hayes spoke for the first time since the meeting began. He rose from his chair with the dignity of a man who had spent 40 years commanding operating rooms, his voice carrying an authority that demanded attention. I've spent my career treating physical injuries, he said, his gaze moving across each member of my family. But I've also seen the damage that emotional abuse inflicts, damage that doesn't show on X-rays, but is just as real, just as lasting, and often more difficult to heal. He turned to face my parents directly. What I witnessed at Christmas dinner, and what these recordings document, constitutes a pattern of psychological abuse. This isn't sensitivity or misunderstanding on Shelby's part. This is systematic harm inflicted on a family member over decades. The effects are measurable and lasting. In my professional opinion, this family has engaged in deliberate emotional cruelty toward Shelby since her childhood. For the first time in my life, someone with authority and credibility had named what I experienced as abuse. Not teasing, not family dynamics, not sensitivity. Abuse. The validation felt like oxygen after years of drowning. My family could not dismiss this as my imagination. They could not rewrite history with gaslighting and denial. A respected physician had witnessed their behavior and condemned it in terms that could not be misunderstood. The silence stretched until my father broke it. He stood slowly, his composure finally cracking into something raw and ugly. The mask he had worn for decades fell away, revealing the cold contempt that had always lurked beneath his quiet exterior. "You owe us everything," he said, his voice sharp with entitlement. "We raised you. We fed you. We clothed you. We made you who you are. Every skill you have, every opportunity you've received, every breath you take, you have because of us. You should be grateful, not sitting here accusing the people who gave you life." His words confirmed what I had long suspected in his mind. I was property, not a person. A debt to be collected, not a daughter to be loved. Marissa, emboldened by our father's display, added her own contribution. She laughed the same cruel laugh from the Christmas recording and said, "She always needed to be put in her place. Someone had to do it. She was getting too full of herself, asking questions about Grandma's money, threatening to hire lawyers. We just reminded her where she belonged." The room went still. Even my mother looked shocked by the raw cruelty in Marissa's voice, though she said nothing to contradict it. They had just confirmed on recording that their treatment of me was intentional. Not accidental cruelty, not insensitivity, not family miscommunication. Deliberate, calculated harm designed to keep me subordinate and silent. They had confessed without realizing they were confessing. Shelby let the silence stretch for a long moment. Then she stood, looked at her father directly, and said, "Thank you for finally being honest about who you really are. Phase 2 begins now." Phase 2 began the moment I returned to Texas. I had left my parents' house immediately after declaring that the real consequences were about to start. Their faces, my mother's tear-streaked confusion, Marissa's dawning horror, my father's barely controlled rage stayed with me during the entire flight home. They had spent decades believing they were untouchable, that their crimes would remain hidden behind the family loyalty they had weaponized against me. That belief was about to be shattered. Within 72 hours of the confrontation, I filed comprehensive reports with multiple authorities. Margaret Chen helped me prepare the documentation, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly organized and legally admissible. We submitted detailed complaints to local law enforcement covering identity theft and forgery. We filed reports with the State Attorney General's office regarding financial exploitation of a family member. We contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division about wire fraud involving the interstate transfer of stolen funds. Each agency received the same meticulous evidence package: forged signatures, fraudulent loan applications, bank records, timeline charts, and the recordings that captured my family's own admissions. The response came faster than I had dared to hope. Margaret called me 4 days after the filings to report that multiple investigations had been opened. "Your documentation is exceptional," she said, professional admiration evident in her voice. "Most fraud cases take months to establish probable cause. You've essentially done the investigators' work for them. They're moving quickly because there's nothing to dispute." She explained the legal framework that made prosecution possible. Because my family had used my identity to open a new loan just 6 months earlier, the fraud was considered ongoing rather than historical. The statute of limitations had not expired. Additionally, Texas law, where I resided and where I had made the recordings, recognized single-party consent for audio documentation. Every recording I had made was legally obtained and admissible as evidence. My family's own words could be used against them in court. The first visible consequence struck Marissa hardest. I learned later that investigators had moved to freeze accounts connected to the fraudulent loans almost immediately. Marissa's access to money, the stolen money that had funded her entire lifestyle, was cut off virtually overnight. Within a week, the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for years began to collapse. Her credit cards were declined at the boutiques where she had always been a valued customer. Her luxury gym membership was canceled when the payment failed. Her designer store accounts were frozen pending investigation. The country club where she had brunched with other wealthy wives sent a polite letter suspending her membership until financial matters were resolved. Every visible marker of the success and superiority she had always flaunted over me disappeared in days. The phone calls started almost immediately. The first one came at 2 a.m, Marissa's voice raw with rage. What have you done? What have you done? They're saying I can't access my own accounts. They're talking about fraud charges. You've destroyed everything. I said, nothing, simply letting her rant, while my phone recorded every word. She screamed, she threatened. She called me names I had heard from her my entire life, but now delivered with a desperation that revealed how completely her world had crumbled. When the screaming exhausted itself, her tone shifted to begging. Shelby, please, you don't understand. I can't live like this. I have nothing without those accounts. You have to call someone, tell them it was a misunderstanding. We can work this out as a family, please. There is no misunderstanding, I said quietly. There's only the truth, finally documented, where it can't be denied. I hung up and saved the recording to my evidence file. Her threatening calls and desperate voicemails would only strengthen the case against her. My parents' situation was equally dire. They faced potential criminal charges for forgery fraud and financial exploitation charges that could result in significant prison time, especially given the duration and scope of their crimes. Their arrogance dissolved into panic as attorneys explained the legal exposure they faced. They tried to hire defense lawyers, but their financial situation, the very situation created by their own theft, limited their options. The business accounts were frozen. The personal accounts were under investigation. The assets they had accumulated through decades of fraud were now evidence in criminal cases, rather than resources they could deploy for their defense. They attempted to contact me through intermediaries, distant relatives, old family friends, even a minister from a church they hadn't attended in years. Each messenger arrived with the same basic offer: if I would withdraw my complaints and refuse to cooperate with investigators, they would make amends. They would pay me back. They would apologize publicly. They would do whatever I wanted if I would just make this stop. I refused every overture. The investigation was no longer mine to stop, even if I had wanted to. Law enforcement had independent evidence now. They had my family's recorded admissions. They had the documented trail of fraud spanning nearly a decade. The machinery of justice was in motion, and no amount of family pressure or false promises could halt it. The family that had believed they were untouchable was learning how wrong they were. Every shortcut they had taken, every crime they had committed, every lie they had told, all of it was unraveling simultaneously. The carefully constructed image of respectability they had maintained in their community was dissolving under the weight of public legal filings anyone could access. I tracked the developments from my apartment in Texas, receiving regular updates from Margaret Chen and occasionally from investigators who needed clarification on specific evidence. I felt no joy watching my family's destruction, but I felt no guilt either. They had chosen their path. I was simply ensuring they finally faced the consequences of walking it. 2 weeks after the initial filings, my phone buzzed with a text from an old neighbor who still lived near my parents. Something happening at your parents' house. Marissa just arrived, lots of screaming. I learned later what had triggered the commotion. The IRS had contacted Marissa directly about discrepancies in years of tax filings, discrepancies connected to income she had failed to report from the fraudulent accounts. The federal government was now involved, and federal charges carried far more severe penalties than state prosecution. Then the IRS called Marissa directly about discrepancies in years of tax filings. Her scream could be heard through the walls, but Shelby knew the legal consequences were only the beginning. The real reckoning hadn't even started. The IRS involvement accelerated everything. Federal attention transformed my family's legal troubles from a local embarrassment into something far more serious, and news spread through their social circles with the devastating speed of wildfire through dry brush. I observed the social collapse from my apartment in Texas, receiving updates from Margaret Chen, occasional texts from Mr. Davis, and increasingly desperate communications from family members I had barely spoken to in years. The picture that emerged was one of complete isolation, the systematic abandonment of people who had spent decades cultivating relationships built on the illusion of success and respectability. The friends who had attended my parents' holiday parties for years suddenly became impossible to reach. Women who had complimented my mother's hosting and gossiped with her over wine now claimed to be too busy for coffee dates. Men who had played golf with my father and discussed business opportunities over dinner stopped returning calls. The couples they had socialized with for decades quietly distanced themselves, afraid that association with an ongoing federal investigation might somehow contaminate their own reputations. The business consequences were equally swift. Partners who had praised my father's leadership and trusted his financial judgment now refused to speak with him directly. Long-standing vendor relationships were terminated with politely worded letters citing changes in business priorities. The bank that had worked with the family company for 20 years requested immediate repayment of outstanding credit lines, claiming concerns about account irregularities that suddenly seemed important enough to act upon. The country club, that bastion of social standing my mother had worked so hard to infiltrate and maintain, sent a formal letter suspending their membership pending review of recent developments. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the message was clear. They were no longer welcome among people they had spent years trying to impress. The carefully curated image of respectability my mother had valued above everything, including her own daughter's well-being, was being dismantled piece by piece. I felt no satisfaction watching their social destruction, but I recognized its significance. These were the people my family had prioritized over me. These were the relationships they had cultivated while neglecting their own child. These were the friends whose opinions mattered more than my pain, whose approval was worth sacrificing my dignity to maintain. And now those same people were abandoning my family without a second thought, proving that the social standing my parents had worshipped was as hollow as their love had always been. Marissa's situation deteriorated even faster than our parents'. Her husband, a man named Bradley, whom I had always found superficial and calculating, had married her partly for the family's perceived wealth and social position. He had enjoyed the luxury lifestyle, the impressive in-laws, the country club memberships that came with being part of the Torres family. When those benefits evaporated overnight, so did his commitment to the marriage. Their arguments, reported to me through various sources who seemed eager to share the family's disgrace, exposed dysfunction that had apparently been festering for years. Bradley accused Marissa of trapping him in a marriage built on lies. Marissa accused Bradley of infidelity that she had tolerated only because she needed his income to maintain appearances. They screamed at each other about money they no longer had, status they could no longer claim, and a relationship that had never contained anything resembling genuine love. Bradley filed for divorce 3 weeks after the investigation became public. His legal team moved aggressively to separate his assets from any claim Marissa might make, arguing that he shouldn't be held responsible for debts incurred through her family's criminal activities. The man who had stood beside her at charity galas and family portraits now characterized her as a fraud and a liar in legal documents anyone could access. Without money to maintain the illusion of success, without status to project superiority, without a husband to validate her choices, Marissa had nothing. The identity she had constructed her entire life, the golden child, the successful daughter, the woman who had everything her pathetic sister lacked, was revealed as a hollow shell built on stolen funds and forged signatures. Everything she had used to make me feel worthless was gone, and what remained was just a desperate woman facing criminal charges with no resources and no support. The reversal in how extended family treated me was almost disorienting. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly reached out with messages of support. An aunt who had always deferred to my mother's version of family events now admitted she had seen troubling patterns and regretted not speaking up. A distant uncle confessed he had never liked how my parents treated me at family gatherings, but hadn't wanted to cause conflict by mentioning it. "I always thought something wasn't right," one cousin wrote in a long email. "The way they talked about you, the way Marissa was always praised while you were ignored, it bothered me. But I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I'm sorry I let them treat you that way." The community that had once viewed me as the awkward, unsuccessful sister now recognized a different truth. People who had attended the same schools, the same churches, the same social events as my family began reaching out with their own observations. They had noticed the favoritism. They had seen the cruelty. They had witnessed moments of mockery and dismissal that they now understood were part of a larger pattern of abuse. The narrative had completely reversed. I was no longer the family disappointment who couldn't measure up to her perfect sister. I was the survivor who had endured decades of hidden abuse and emerged with the courage to demand accountability. The sympathy that had always been directed toward my parents and Marissa for having to deal with difficult Shelby now flowed toward me for having survived them. I accepted the support graciously, though part of me wanted to ask where these concerned relatives and observant acquaintances had been during the decades when I needed someone to intervene. But I understood that confronting bystanders served no purpose. The people reaching out now were trying to make amends in the only way they could. Their belated recognition didn't change the past, but it validated what I had always known: the abuse had been real, visible to anyone willing to see it, and wrong in ways that decent people recognized even if they had failed to act. Shelby watched her family's world crumble from a distance, waiting for the right moment to deliver the next revelation. But the biggest secrets hadn't been exposed yet, and they would change everything she thought she knew. The biggest secrets began to surface 3 weeks after the federal investigation became public knowledge. I received a call from my mother, not the desperate, manipulative calls she had made before, but something different. Her voice was hollow, exhausted, stripped of the performance she had maintained my entire life. She asked if I would visit her alone without lawyers or witnesses, without Dr. Hayes or Mr. Davis. Just the two of us, mother and daughter, for what she said might be the last honest conversation they would ever have. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I found her in the house where I had grown up, but everything about the space felt different. The curtains were drawn. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink. The immaculate presentation she had always maintained for visitors had collapsed along with everything else. My mother sat in the living room wearing clothes I had never seen her wear outside the bedroom. Her hair uncombed, her face bare of the makeup she treated as armor against the world. Without my father's controlling presence, without Marissa's constant demands, my mother seemed smaller somehow, diminished. The woman who had laughed while I lay on the floor at Christmas dinner now looked like someone who had been defeated by forces she never had the strength to resist. "Sit down, Shelby," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you years ago." I sat saying nothing, waiting for whatever performance she had prepared. But what came wasn't a performance. It was a confession. "When I married your father," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I was escaping my own family's dysfunction. I thought I was building something better. Instead, I walked into something worse." She described her early years of marriage, the way her mother-in-law, my father's mother, had treated her with cruelty and dismissal from the very beginning. The constant criticism, the deliberate exclusion, the systematic campaign to make her feel worthless and unwelcome in her own home. The patterns she described sounded painfully familiar. "She never accepted me," my mother continued. "She made my life miserable for years, and your father did nothing to stop her. He just watched the way he always watches, calculating, but never intervening." I recognized the dynamic she was describing, the same dynamic I had experienced my entire life with my mother playing the role her mother-in-law had once occupied. "So you became her," I said flatly. "You experienced cruelty, and instead of breaking the cycle, you passed it on to me." My mother flinched, but didn't deny it. "I chose survival. I sided with whoever held power because that was the only way I knew to protect myself. When your father made it clear that strength was valued and weakness was punished, I learned to align myself with strength, even when that meant sacrificing you." She looked at me with eyes filled with something that might have been genuine remorse. "I chose the path of least resistance over protecting my own child. I told myself I was doing what I had to do. but the truth is I was a coward. I let them hurt you because fighting back would have cost me too much." The confession hung in the air between us. I had always known my mother had failed to protect me, but hearing her admit it, hearing her acknowledge the deliberate choice she had made, felt like a wound being cleaned with salt. Then she told me something I had never suspected. 20 years ago, she said, her voice dropping even lower. During a period when your father and I were barely speaking, I had an affair. It was brief, foolish, a moment of weakness I've regretted ever since. I became pregnant, and I was never entirely certain whether your father was the baby's father. I felt the world tilt beneath me. "What are you saying?" "Marissa," my mother whispered. "I didn't know if she was your father's biological daughter. I was terrified of what would happen if he found out, so I secretly obtained a DNA test when she was young. The results confirmed my fears. Marissa is not your father's child." The revelation crashed over me like a wave. Marissa, the golden child, the favored daughter, the one who could do no wrong, was not my father's biological daughter. The sister who had spent our entire lives being prioritized over me, being praised while I was dismissed, being treated as the real Torres heir. While I was treated as an afterthought, she didn't share his blood at all. "I hid the evidence," my mother continued. "I thought I had buried it so deeply no one would ever find it. But Marissa discovered the test results when she was 18, going through papers she had no business touching. And she's been blackmailing you ever since?" I said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. My mother nodded miserably. "For 15 years, she demanded money, favors, constant priority over you. She made me choose her publicly, praise her constantly, give her everything she wanted. If I refused, she threatened to tell your father the truth. I was trapped." The behavioral patterns I had observed my entire life suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. Marissa's desperate, almost frantic need for our father's approval, her fury whenever I received any positive attention, her obsessive pursuit of status success, visible markers of belonging. She had spent her entire adult life knowing she might not truly be part of this family, using blackmail to secure a position she feared losing at any moment. It didn't excuse her cruelty. Nothing could excuse the years of mockery, the identity theft, the role she had played in my accident. But it explained the bottomless insecurity driving her behavior, the terror of being exposed as an imposter, the rage at someone like me who belonged by birthright to a family she could only claim through manipulation and threats. Most importantly, I realized something my mother hadn't explicitly stated: my father didn't know any of this. The man who had orchestrated so much harm, who had controlled our family from the shadows for decades, had no idea that his favored daughter wasn't his daughter at all. Shelby left her mother's house, understanding that everyone in her family was both victim and villain trapped in a web of secrets. But compassion didn't mean forgiveness, and the person she needed to confront next was the sister who had destroyed her life. The confrontation with my mother had left me reeling, but I couldn't stop now. The web of secrets that had defined my family was finally unraveling, and I needed to see it through to the end. The next thread I had to pull was Marissa herself. Finding her was easier than I expected. She had been evicted from the luxury apartment she shared with Bradley. His name was on the lease, and he had wasted no time removing her once the divorce proceedings began. She was staying in a cheap, extended-stay motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place she would have mocked mercilessly just months ago. The kind of place she would have used as evidence of someone else's failure while congratulating herself on her own superior life choices. I knocked on the door of room 147 and waited. The woman who answered was unrecognizable. The Marissa I had known my entire life was always immaculately presented, hairstyled, makeup, perfect clothes carefully chosen to project success and sophistication. The woman standing in the doorway of that motel room looked like a ghost wearing my sister's face. Her hair hung in unwashed tangles around her shoulders. Her hands trembled visibly, whether from anxiety or alcohol withdrawal, I couldn't tell. Dark circles carved deep shadows under her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights that had stretched into weeks. Behind her, I could see the room in disarray. Empty wine bottles lined the dresser. Takeout containers overflowed from a small trash can. Clothes lay scattered across unmade beds. The air smelled stale, recycled, thick with desperation and defeat. "What do you want?" Marissa's voice cracked on the words, none of the usual venom present. She sounded exhausted, hollowed out like someone who had already lost everything and was simply waiting for the final blow. "We need to talk," I said. "Can I come in?" She laughed a bitter, broken sound, nothing like the cruel laughter I had heard my entire life. "Why not? You've already destroyed everything else. Might as well see what's left." She stepped aside and let me enter. I moved a pile of clothes from a chair and sat down while Marissa collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her posture defeated, her eyes avoiding mine. "Bradley filed the divorce papers yesterday," she said flatly. "He's claiming I defrauded him by concealing the family's financial crimes. His lawyers are trying to ensure he gets everything, the house, the cars, even the furniture we bought together. Says he's the victim of my family's criminal enterprise." I said nothing, waiting. "My accounts are still frozen. I can't access anything. The credit cards are canceled. The memberships are gone. My friends won't return my calls." She laughed again, that same hollow sound. Turns out all those relationships were conditional on me being someone worth knowing. The moment I became toxic, they disappeared. Every single one. The glamorous, confident sister who had tormented me for decades had collapsed entirely. The expensive surface she had maintained so carefully, the designer clothes, the luxury lifestyle, the image of effortless superiority had been stripped away to reveal what had always been underneath a terrified, insecure person who had spent her entire adult life running from a truth she couldn't escape. "I know about the DNA test," I said quietly. Marissa's head snapped up, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. I saw fear there, raw, primal fear, but also something that looked almost like relief. "Mom told you?" "Yes." I expected denial. I expected deflection, or anger, or another attempt at manipulation. Instead, the final wall of pretense simply fell away. Marissa's face crumpled, and she began to cry. Not the performative tears I had seen from my mother, but genuine sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded. "You don't understand," she managed between ragged breaths. "I found out I might not be his daughter when I was 18. 18 years old, going through Mom's papers looking for my birth certificate for a college application, and I found a DNA test that said the man I'd called Dad my whole life might not be my biological father." She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly on the edge of the bed. My whole life suddenly felt like a lie. Everything I thought I knew about who I was, where I belonged, what family meant, all of it shattered in a single moment. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know if I had any right to be part of this family at all. I listened in silence, watching my sister fall apart, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't fully name. "I confronted Mom," Marissa continued. "She begged me not to tell Dad. She said it would destroy the family, destroy her, destroy everything. She promised she would make it up to me, give me whatever I wanted as long as I kept the secret." "So you blackmailed her?" Marissa flinched at the word but didn't deny it. "I told myself I deserved it. I told myself I was just securing my position, making sure I wouldn't be thrown away if the truth ever came out. I made Mom prioritize me over you, give me money, support, everything I did. I thought if I could just be valuable enough, successful enough, important enough to this family, then maybe it wouldn't matter whose DNA I carried. Maybe Dad would love me anyway, even if he ever found out." Her voice broke on the last words, and fresh sobs shook her shoulders. "I did everything he asked," she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Everything. For years. I became his perfect daughter, his loyal ally, his weapon against anyone who threatened the family, including you. I thought if I proved myself useful enough, indispensable enough, he would never let me go. I thought I could earn a place that you had just by existing." The twisted logic of her behavior finally made sense. Every cruel comment, every deliberate humiliation, every crime she had committed against me. It had all been driven by desperate insecurity, by the terror of being exposed as someone who didn't truly belong. She had spent 15 years trying to prove she deserved to be a Torres, never realizing that the harder she tried, the more she destroyed herself. "Mom told me the full truth after the investigation started," Marissa said. "She finally admitted what the DNA test actually showed. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't uncertain. The results were conclusive." She looked up at me with devastated eyes. "He's not my biological father. He never was. And I spent 15 years destroying my own sister, committing crimes, ruining my life, all to secure a position in a family I was never really part of." She laughed again, but this time the sound dissolved into tears. "I destroyed your life for nothing, Shelby. For absolutely nothing. Everything I did to you, every horrible thing, it was all for a lie. I thought I was protecting my place in this family, but I never had a place to protect. I was fighting for something that didn't exist. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt satisfaction at watching the sister who had tormented me finally face the consequences of her choices. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. Grief for the relationship we might have had, for the sisters we might have been if our family hadn't poisoned everything it touched. But grief didn't mean absolution. Understanding didn't mean forgiveness. Marissa had made choices regardless of what drove them. She had hurt me deliberately and repeatedly for years. The pain she had caused wasn't erased by the pain she had experienced. "There's still something I need to know," I said quietly. "My accident. 4 years ago. I know it wasn't an accident. I know someone arranged for me to be pushed off that catwalk. I need to know the truth about what happened." Marissa's crying intensified. She shook her head, her whole body trembling. "Marissa, tell me." She looked at me through tear-blurred eyes, and I saw something shift in her expression. Some final barrier giving way, some last secret preparing to emerge. Then, between heaving sobs, Marissa said the words that shattered everything Shelby thought she understood. "You want to know who really planned your accident? It wasn't me. It was Dad. I was just following his orders." The words hung in the air between us, impossible and undeniable at the same time. Dad. It was Dad. The quiet man who had watched from the shadows my entire life, who had let others take the spotlight while he calculated and controlled from behind his mask of passivity, he was the one who had orchestrated my destruction. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My hand moved to my phone, activating the recording app with a subtle gesture. Texas was a one-party consent state. I was part of this conversation. Everything Marissa said would be legally admissible. Marissa wiped her eyes with trembling hands, but the tears kept coming. She had held this secret for 4 years, carried the weight of what she had done, while pretending to be the successful superior sister. Now the dam had broken, and the truth poured out of her like poison being purged from a wound. "It started about 6 months before your accident," she began, her voice hollow and distant. "Dad came to me with a proposal. He said the business was in trouble, serious trouble, and he needed my help with something important. Something that would secure our family's future." She laughed bitterly, the sound scraping against the walls of the cheap motel room. "I was so grateful, so pathetically grateful that he was finally treating me like a partner, like someone he trusted. I'd spent years trying to prove myself to him, terrified that he would somehow discover I wasn't his real daughter. And here he was choosing me for something crucial, confiding in me, making me feel like I belonged." I remained silent, letting her continue, making sure the recording captured every word. "He explained that you were becoming a problem. You were asking questions about Grandma's estate, talking about hiring your own attorney to look into the inheritance. He said if you started investigating, you'd uncover things that would destroy the family. He made it sound like protecting you from yourself, like we were doing you a favor by stopping you before you ruined everything." The manipulation was breathtaking in its precision. My father had framed attempted murder as family protection had convinced Marissa that hurting me was actually helping me. "What exactly did he tell you to do?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, professional, like I was conducting an audit, rather than uncovering the conspiracy that had shattered my body and stolen 4 years of my life. Marissa's hands twisted together in her lap. "He planned everything. The job recommendation came from him. He had a contact at that manufacturing company, someone who owed him a favor. He made sure you were assigned to audit their facility, knowing you'd have to tour the production floor as part of the safety orientation." My stomach turned as I remembered how enthusiastic my father had been about that job opportunity, how he had pushed me to accept it despite my hesitation, how he had assured me it was a great career move. "The timing was specific," Marissa continued. "He knew exactly when you'd be on that catwalk, which section of the facility had the oldest safety equipment, where the cameras had blind spots. He'd been planning it for weeks, maybe months. I didn't understand how detailed his preparation was until I saw everything come together." "And your role?" I pressed gently. She closed her eyes as if she couldn't bear to look at me while she confessed. "I was supposed to be there that day. In the facility. Dad got me visitor access through the same contact. I was supposed to wait until you were in position on the catwalk, then create a distraction that would draw the safety officer away from you. And when you were alone..." Her voice broke. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to continue. "I was supposed to push you, make it look like you lost your balance. The harness clip had already been tampered with. Dad had arranged that too. All I had to do was give you a push at the right moment, and the faulty equipment would make it look like an accident." The clinical precision of it horrified me. My own father had engineered my near death with the same methodical attention he brought to business calculations. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed, a variable in an equation he was determined to balance in his favor. "He told me exactly what to do," Marissa said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Where to position myself, when to act, how to make it look like equipment failure. He coached me on what to say if anyone asked questions, how to establish an alibi, how to make sure nothing could be traced back to us." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, her face a mask of devastated guilt. "He said if I helped him, he would finally see me as his real partner, his true daughter. He said I would prove that I was more valuable than you ever were, that I deserved my place in this family regardless of biology. He made me believe that hurting you was the path to finally belonging." The bitter laugh returned sharper this time. "I was so desperate to belong that I nearly killed my own sister, and he never planned to give me anything. I was just another tool to him, like everyone else. Like Mom. Like you. Like anyone who served his purposes until they became inconvenient. The moment I became a liability instead of an asset, he would have discarded me without a second thought." I needed more specifics, more details that investigators could verify. "The insurance payout," I said. "Was that part of the plan?" Marissa nodded. "Dad had taken out additional insurance policies on you months before the accident, disability insurance, some kind of key employee coverage through a shell company. When you were injured, the payouts went directly to accounts he controlled, hundreds of thousands of dollars, all funneled through the same channels he used for everything else. The $50,000 transfer I had found in my investigation, the one made exactly 1 week before my accident. Now I understood. It wasn't payment to someone. It was preparation money funds positioned to handle whatever expenses the conspiracy required. "Why did he need me disabled?" I asked, though I already knew part of the answer. "It wasn't just about the insurance money, was it?" "No." Marissa's voice was hollow. "He said you were too smart, too capable. He said if you recovered fully, if you maintained your career and independence, you would eventually discover what he'd been doing with the family finances. You were already asking about Grandma's estate, already talking about lawyers. He needed you, weakened physically, financially, psychologically. He needed you dependent on the family so he could control you." The depth of my father's calculation took my breath away. He hadn't just wanted me hurt. He had wanted me broken. He had designed my injury to limit my career, drain my resources through medical expenses, and psychologically devastate me to the point where I would never have the strength to investigate his crimes. And the pressure to avoid legal action afterward? I asked. That was all him, too. He convinced you to take the settlement and drop any investigation because a lawsuit would have exposed what really happened. If experts examined the equipment, if investigators looked too closely at the timeline, they might have discovered the sabotage. He needed you to accept the accident story and move on. I had accepted it. For 4 years, I had believed my own father's lies, trusted his apparently caring advice, and never suspected that the man telling me to focus on healing was the same man who had arranged for me to be pushed off a catwalk. Is there anything else? I asked. Anything that might help prove what you're telling me? Marissa thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Dad kept records. He always keeps records. He's paranoid about being betrayed, so he documents everything as insurance. There might be files somewhere, communications, something that proves his involvement. And the contact at the manufacturing company, the one who helped arrange everything, his name is Richard Brennan. He might be willing to talk if he's offered immunity. I ended the recording and looked at my broken sister. The woman who had tormented me for decades, who had pushed me off a catwalk on our father's orders, who had participated in a conspiracy to destroy my life. She sat before me in a cheap motel room stripped of everything she had valued, confessing to crimes that would likely send her to prison. I had come seeking justice. I hadn't expected to feel a complicated kind of pity for the woman who had crippled me. But pity wouldn't stop what had to happen next. Their father still needed to pay. I left Marissa's motel room with her recorded confession saved in 3 separate locations on my phone and uploaded to secure cloud storage. The evidence I now possessed would transform everything. What had begun as an investigation into financial fraud had become something far more serious, a documented conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm to a family member. I contacted Margaret Chen, immediately explaining what Marissa had revealed. Within hours, we had arranged a meeting with the lead investigator on my family's case, a serious woman named Detective Sarah Morrison, who had been handling the fraud charges. When I played her the recording and provided context about my accident, her expression shifted from professional interest to barely contained anger. "This changes everything," she said. "Conspiracy to cause serious bodily harm carries much longer sentences than financial crimes. And if we can corroborate what your sister described, there's no possibility of plea bargaining this down to something minor." The investigation accelerated with new focus. Detectives who had been tracing money through fraudulent accounts now turned their attention to phone records, security footage, and witness statements from 4 years ago. What they found confirmed everything Marissa had confessed. Phone records showed multiple calls between my father and Marissa on the day of my accident calls that lasted several minutes, timed suspiciously close to when I fell from the catwalk. Security camera footage from businesses near the manufacturing facility captured Marissa's car arriving that morning and leaving shortly after emergency vehicles responded to my injury. Financial records proved my father had benefited directly from the insurance payouts, with funds flowing into accounts he controlled within weeks of my hospitalization. Richard Brennan, the manufacturing contact Marissa had mentioned, was located and questioned. Facing potential charges as an accessory, he cooperated fully, providing documentation of communications with my father about arranging visitor access and identifying which safety equipment was due for inspection information that would have allowed someone to know exactly which harness clips were most vulnerable to tampering. The case against my father was overwhelming. Detective Morrison told me they had enough evidence to arrest him on charges of conspiracy to cause serious bodily harm, insurance fraud, and racketeering. Combined with the existing financial crimes, he faced decades in prison if convicted. I asked to be present when they made the arrest. I'm not sure why. Perhaps I needed to see the mask finally stripped away to witness the moment when the man who had orchestrated my destruction was forced to face consequences he never believed would come. Detective Morrison hesitated, citing procedure and safety concerns, but ultimately agreed to let me observe from a distance. We arrived at my parents' house on a Tuesday morning. 3 police vehicles pulling into the driveway where I had parked so many times during painful holiday visits. The house looked the same as it always had, well-maintained, respectable, projecting an image of stability that had nothing to do with the rot festering inside. Officers approached the front door while I stood near the lead vehicle watching through the windshield. My mother answered her face, cycling through confusion, fear, and resignation, as Detective Morrison explained they had a warrant for my father's arrest. She stepped aside without protest, her shoulders slumping as though she had been expecting this moment, and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. My father emerged from inside the house a moment later, flanked by 2 officers. For a brief instant, his expression held the same calculated neutrality I had seen my entire life, the mask of the passive, uninvolved man who let others take responsibility while he observed from the shadows. Then he saw me standing by the police car, and the mask shattered completely. The transformation was terrifying in its totality. The quiet, detached demeanor vanished, replaced by something cold and venomous that I had only glimpsed in fragments throughout my life. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me take an involuntary step backward, and his face twisted into an expression of pure, undisguised contempt. "You," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the driveway. "You did this." Officers moved to restrain him more firmly, but he didn't struggle physically. The violence was all in his words, in the hatred pouring through his gaze. "You were always the problem," he continued, ignoring the detective's attempts to read him his rights. "Too curious, too stubborn, always asking questions, always poking into things that weren't your business. Too much like your grandmother, that meddling woman who never knew when to leave well enough alone." He laughed, a harsh sound, nothing like the quiet chuckles I remembered from family dinners. "I should have dealt with you properly years ago instead of just slowing you down. I thought the accident would be enough, thought you'd be too broken to ever threaten anything again. But you just kept going, didn't you? Kept digging. Kept building your pathetic little career. Kept waiting for your chance to destroy everything I built." The officers were handcuffing him now, pulling his arms behind his back. But he continued speaking as though compelled to finally reveal the truth he had hidden for so long. "Do you know how hard I worked? How many years I spent building this family's position, managing everyone's weaknesses, keeping all the pieces in place? Your mother was useless, weak, and fearful, good for nothing but following orders. Marissa was desperate and controllable, so eager to belong that she'd do anything I asked. But you," his voice dripped with bitterness, "you were never controllable. You were always the risk I couldn't manage, the variable I couldn't eliminate." They were leading him toward the police car now, but he twisted to keep his eyes on me. "You think you've won? You think this is justice? You've destroyed your own family, Shelby. You've torn apart everything your grandmother claimed to want protected. And for what? So you can feel righteous, so you can pretend you're the victim when you're really just a vindictive little—" The officer pushed him into the back seat of the police car, cutting off whatever final insult he had prepared. The door slammed shut, and suddenly the driveway was quiet, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood there watching as the police car backed out of the driveway, my father's face visible through the rear window, his eyes still fixed on me with that terrible contempt. The man I had feared my entire life, the man I had tried so desperately to please, the man whose approval I had sought, even while he orchestrated my destruction, he was finally being held accountable. I had expected to feel triumph. I had expected satisfaction, vindication, perhaps even joy at seeing justice finally served. Instead, I felt grief. Not for the monster in the police car, he deserved everything that was coming to him, and more. The grief was for something else entirely, for the father I had never actually had. For the protector I had deserved but never received. For the loving parent who existed only in my childhood fantasies, in the desperate hope that somewhere beneath my father's coldness was a man who truly cared about his daughter. That hope had sustained me through years of neglect and criticism. Even after discovering the fraud, even after learning about the conspiracy, Some small part of me had clung to the possibility that I had misunderstood, that there was an explanation that would make my father something other than the monster the evidence revealed. Watching him spit venom at me from the driveway, seeing the genuine hatred in his eyes, I finally understood that the father I had hoped for had never existed. He was a fiction I had created to survive my childhood, a fantasy I had maintained because the alternative was too painful to accept. The man who raised me had never loved me. He had only ever seen me as an obstacle, a threat, a problem to be managed and eventually eliminated. Every moment of apparent warmth, every piece of seemingly caring advice, every instance where I thought I glimpsed something paternal in his eyes, all of it had been manipulation, camouflage for the cold calculation that had always been his true nature. My mother appeared in the doorway of the house, watching the police cars disappear down the street. She looked older than I had ever seen her, diminished and defeated. We stared at each other across the distance of the driveway, and I saw in her eyes the reflection of my own grief, mourning not what was lost, but what had never truly been. Her father was gone. Her family was destroyed. Justice was finally happening. But Shelby still didn't know the full truth. Her grandmother had one more secret waiting to be discovered. The week following my father's arrest passed in a blur of legal consultations, investigator interviews, and sleepless nights spent processing everything that had happened. I had returned to Texas seeking the familiar comfort of my apartment, and the distance from a hometown now saturated with painful revelations. The family I had spent my entire life trying to belong to was destroyed, scattered like debris after an explosion I had triggered with the truth. I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at coffee that had gone cold hours ago when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Patricia Thornton, identifying herself as an attorney from a firm I had never heard of. "Ms. Torres, I've been waiting for the appropriate time to contact you," she said, her voice carrying the measured professionalism of someone accustomed to delivering significant news. "I represent the estate of Eleanor Torres, your grandmother. She left specific instructions that certain materials were to be released to you only under particular circumstances. Those circumstances have now been met." My heart began to pound. "Art. What kind of materials?" "I think it would be better if we discussed this in person. Are you able to come to my office tomorrow? There's quite a lot to go through, and your grandmother was very specific about how she wanted everything presented." I booked a flight that night. Patricia Thornton's office occupied a corner suite in a downtown Houston high-rise, tastefully decorated with the understated elegance of old money and established reputation. She greeted me personally, leading me to a private conference room where several boxes of documents waited on the polished table. "Your grandmother was one of the most meticulous clients I've ever worked with," Patricia said as she began unpacking the materials. "She came to me 7 years ago, shortly after she began suspecting her family's criminal activities. She knew something was wrong, and she wanted to ensure that if her suspicions proved correct, the truth would eventually come to light." She spread documents across the table, comprehensive reports from a private investigator Eleanor had hired to document the family's financial crimes, recordings of conversations captured before her death, legal documents establishing inheritance provisions I had never known existed, and at the center of everything, a thick envelope bearing my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. My name was written on the front in careful script for Shelby, when the time is right. "The investigator's reports document years of financial manipulation," Patricia explained, gesturing to one stack of papers. "Your grandmother traced fraudulent transactions, identified shell companies, and gathered evidence of identity theft against you that predates even the earliest crimes you uncovered yourself. She knew what they were doing to you, Shelby. She knew, and she spent her final years preparing for this moment." I picked up one of the reports, scanning pages filled with dates, account numbers, and transaction records. My grandmother had hired professionals to investigate. Her own son had paid for surveillance, and forensic accounting had built a case against her family while pretending to be a harmless elderly woman losing her mental sharpness. "The recordings are particularly significant," Patricia continued. "Your grandmother managed to capture conversations with Marissa during the final year of her life, conversations in which Marissa made incriminating admissions about the family's activities. Your grandmother was careful to ensure these recordings were made in compliance with state law. The scope of Eleanor's preparation was staggering. She had anticipated nearly everything that would eventually happen, had gathered evidence I hadn't known existed, and had ensured it would reach me when I needed it most. The inheritance documents are also here, Patricia said, her voice softening slightly. Your grandmother's estate was substantial, far larger than anyone in your family realized. She had been quietly protecting and growing her assets for decades, keeping them separate from the family business and hidden from her son's knowledge. The entire estate was left to you, Shelby. You are the sole heir to everything she accumulated over her lifetime. I couldn't process the financial implications. My attention was fixed on the envelope bearing my name. She asked me to give you privacy while you read her letter, Patricia said, rising from her chair. Take as much time as you need. I'll be in my office when you're ready to discuss the practical details. She left, closing the door softly behind her. I sat alone in that conference room, holding the envelope my grandmother had prepared for me years ago, knowing that whatever was inside represented her final words, the explanation I had been seeking since this nightmare began. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was long, written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting, the script of a woman who had learned penmanship in an era when such things mattered. I began to read, and by the second paragraph, tears were streaming down my face. My dearest Shelby, the letter began. If you are reading this, my worst fears have come true. I hoped I was wrong about them. I hoped the greed I saw growing in your father and the cruelty I witnessed in your sister would fade with time, that they would choose love over money, family over ambition. But I prepared for the possibility that they would not. By now you have likely discovered some portion of what they have done. The fraud, the theft, perhaps even worse. I wish I could have protected you from this pain. I wish I could have stopped them before they hurt you. But I was fighting enemies who lived inside my own family, and by the time I understood the full scope of their corruption, I was already too ill to confront them directly. I tried to warn you, my darling. I tried so many times. 3 letters written, 3 phone calls made. Your mother intercepted every one. She was afraid, I think, afraid of what your father would do if he knew I was reaching out to you, afraid of losing her precarious position in a family she had never truly controlled. Every concern I raised was dismissed as confusion. Your father had already convinced you I was becoming senile and paranoid. He used my age against me, turned my warnings into evidence of mental decline, ensured that you would doubt anything I might say. By the time I understood how completely they had isolated you from me, I was too ill to fight them openly. The cancer that would eventually take my life had already begun its work, and I knew I didn't have the strength for direct confrontation. So I chose a different path. I gathered evidence. I hired investigators and attorneys and built a case that would survive my death. I prepared your weapons. Shelby, the documentation and resources you would need when the truth finally emerged. I arranged protection for you through people I trusted, and I trusted that when the time came you would find your way to the truth on your own. I'm sorry I couldn't shield you from the pain. I know they hurt you. I could see it in your eyes during those final holiday visits, the way you braced yourself for cruelty that had become routine. I wanted to gather you in my arms and tell you everything to expose their lies right there at the dinner table. But I knew that wouldn't protect you. They would have dismissed my accusations as dementia used my outburst to have me institutionalized and then hurt you worse once I was gone. The only way I could truly protect you was to ensure that when you finally discovered the truth, you would have everything you needed to fight back. I could make certain the pain would not be permanent and that justice would eventually come. The letter continued for several more pages, providing details about the evidence she had gathered, instructions for working with Patricia Thornton, and guidance about the inheritance. But one section in particular made me stop breathing. There is one person in this world I trust completely to watch over you. His name is Daniel Hayes. We loved each other when we were young before family obligations and circumstances separated us. My parents disapproved of him, insisted I marry someone with better prospects, and I was too young and too obedient to fight for what I wanted. But we never stopped caring for each other. We wrote letters for 50 years, Shelby. 50 years of correspondence, sharing our lives across the distance, maintaining a connection that neither marriage nor time could sever. He is the love I never got to have, the path I never got to walk, the life I never got to live. I asked Daniel to protect you if anything happened to me. I asked him to watch over you, to intervene if your family ever crossed the line from cruelty to genuine harm. If you are reading this letter, he kept his promise. Trust him, Shelby. He is the most honorable man I have ever known. Whatever he tells you about your family, about me, about the truth we discovered together, believe him. He has nothing to gain from helping you except the fulfillment of a promise made to a woman he loved. I met with Dr. Hayes the following day, bringing the letter my grandmother had written. When he saw it, tears filled his eyes, the first time I had ever seen him show such raw emotion. She was extraordinary, he said softly, holding the pages as though they were sacred objects. The bravest, most determined woman I ever knew. When she realized what her son had become, she didn't despair or deny it. She planned. She prepared. She made sure you would never face them alone. He confirmed everything the letter revealed. Their youthful love torn apart by family expectations. The correspondence they maintained for half a century. Eleanor's final request that he watch over me, protect me, ensure that justice would eventually come. I've been waiting for this moment since she died, Dr. Hayes said. Waiting for you to discover the truth, waiting for the chance to fulfill the promise I made her. She believed in you, Shelby. She knew you had her strength. She trusted that when the time came you would be ready to fight. Shelby finally understood, even in death, her grandmother had been fighting for her. She had never been as alone as she believed. Now she had her grandmother's love, her grandmother's resources, and for the first time in her life, the freedom to decide her own future. The freedom my grandmother's inheritance provided was overwhelming at first. For years, I had lived carefully managing limited resources while rebuilding a life that my family had tried to destroy. Now I had substantial wealth at my disposal, money that Eleanor had protected and grown specifically for this moment, resources she had kept hidden from the son who would have stolen them if he had known they existed. I spent weeks considering how to use this unexpected gift. Part of me wanted to simply invest it safely to secure my future against any possibility of returning to the vulnerability I had experienced after my accident. But another part of me recognized that my grandmother hadn't just left me money. She had left me an opportunity to transform pain into purpose, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of our family. When I learned that my parents' company was being liquidated through bankruptcy proceedings, the answer became clear. The bankruptcy auction attracted little serious interest. The business had been so thoroughly associated with fraud and criminal activity that most potential buyers wanted nothing to do with it. The physical assets, equipment, property, client contracts that hadn't been canceled were being sold at a fraction of their actual value simply to satisfy creditors and close the proceedings. I purchased everything for less than my grandmother had spent on the private investigators who documented my family's crimes. The irony was not lost on me. The company my father had used to fund decades of fraud and manipulation, the business he had drained to finance Marissa's luxury lifestyle and my own attempted murder, now belonged to the daughter he had tried to destroy. His life's work, such as it was, had passed into the hands of the person he had considered his greatest threat. But I had no interest in simply owning what he had built. I wanted to transform it completely. Working with consultants and advisors over the following months, I restructured the company from the ground up. The construction business became something entirely different, an organization focused on supporting vulnerable people, providing the resources and opportunities that had been denied to me during my darkest years. We established employment programs specifically designed for people recovering from serious injuries, individuals who faced the same barriers I had encountered when trying to rebuild my career after the accident. We created financial literacy services for abuse survivors, teaching them how to protect their assets, recognize exploitation, and build economic independence. We partnered with counseling organizations to provide mental health resources for those rebuilding their lives after family trauma. The business my father had used to fund crimes now served people like the person I used to be, isolated, struggling, underestimated, and deserving of a second chance. The transformation attracted attention I hadn't anticipated. Local media discovered the story, the daughter who survived family betrayal, turning her inheritance into community service, and coverage spread beyond what I had expected. Journalists wanted interviews. Community organizations wanted partnerships. People who had experienced similar family dysfunction reached out to share their stories and express gratitude that someone was creating resources they desperately needed. Business partners who had abandoned my parents during the scandal cautiously began reaching out, impressed by the new direction and interested in being associated with something positive rather than criminal. Staff members who had lost their jobs when the original company collapsed applied for positions in the new organization, grateful for the opportunity to work under leadership they could trust. Within months, the company generated its first legitimate profit. I donated a portion to disability advocacy organizations groups that had supported me during my recovery, that fought for rights and accommodations I had needed to rebuild my career. The money my father had stolen from me, from my grandmother, from everyone he had exploited over the years, was finally being used for something worthwhile. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant informed me that an application had been submitted for an entry-level position in our financial literacy program. The name on the application made me pause. Marissa Torres. I pulled up the file and examined it carefully. Her resume was thin, no meaningful employment history, no relevant skills, nothing that would normally qualify someone for a position requiring integrity and commitment to helping others. Her cover letter was brief, professional, and notably lacking in any acknowledgement of our history or the crimes she had committed. I asked to meet with her personally. She arrived at my office looking nothing like the glamorous, confident sister who had tormented me throughout my life. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple blouse that showed signs of multiple wearings. Her hair was shorter now, easier to maintain without expensive salon visits. The arrogance that had defined her for decades had vanished entirely, leaving behind someone who looked tired, diminished, and desperate. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice carrying none of its former venom. "I know I don't deserve consideration, but I don't have many options left." I studied her across the desk, searching for any trace of manipulation or hidden agenda. All I found was exhaustion. "Why did you apply here?" I asked. "Because I need work. Because no one else will hire me once they discover who I am and what I did. Because—" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Because I thought maybe you would give me a chance to prove I've changed." I let the silence stretch between us, considering my response carefully. "We value honesty and integrity here," I finally said. "Those aren't qualities you've demonstrated. The work we do requires genuine commitment to helping vulnerable people, the same kind of people you spent years hurting." Marissa flinched but didn't argue. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I continued, my voice carrying no cruelty, no satisfaction, only calm finality. "I hope you find peace and purpose and a path forward, but you won't find it working for me. Some doors once closed cannot be reopened." She nodded slowly, accepting the verdict without protest. Whatever she had expected from this meeting, forgiveness perhaps, or the kind of second chance we offered to others, she understood now that certain consequences could not be escaped. She left without argument, walking out of my office and out of my professional life forever. I watched her go, feeling not vindication, but something closer to completion. The sister who had destroyed my life asking me for employment and being refused with the same professional detachment she had always used to dismiss my worth. There was a symmetry to it that felt like closure. Shelby had reclaimed her life, her resources, and her sense of purpose. But there was still one conversation she needed to have, a final confrontation with the parents who had betrayed her, to close that chapter forever. The legal proceedings moved forward with the inevitable momentum of justice delayed but finally arriving. My father remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk concerns, and the severity of charges that now included conspiracy to cause serious bodily harm. His attorneys filed motions and appeals, but the evidence was overwhelming: Marissa's confession, corroborating documentation, witness testimony, and the damning financial trail that connected every crime to his deliberate orchestration. My mother faced lesser charges as an accessory to financial crimes. Her involvement, while significant, was characterized by the prosecution as complicity rather than leadership. She was released pending trial, fitted with an ankle monitor, and restricted to the county where she had spent her entire married life. The social isolation she experienced was perhaps more punishing than any prison sentence. The woman who had valued community standing above her own daughter's well-being now had no community left to impress. She contacted me through Patricia Thornton requesting a meeting. I considered refusing, considered letting silence serve as my final statement. But something in me recognized that I needed this confrontation, not for her sake, but for my own. I needed to close this chapter properly, to speak the words that would sever the last threads connecting me to the family that had tried to destroy me. I agreed to meet her at my parents' house one final time. She answered the door looking like a shadow of the woman who had laughed while I lay on the floor at Christmas dinner. The house behind her was dim curtains drawn against neighbors who might be watching furniture covered with the neglect of someone who had stopped caring about appearances. The mother, who had spent decades maintaining perfect presentation, now wore the same clothes I had seen in previous photographs from her court appearances. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "I wasn't sure you would." I stepped inside without responding, taking a seat in the living room where so many painful holiday gatherings had occurred. She sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes red from crying that had probably begun long before my arrival. "Shelby, I need you to understand," she began. "I'm listening." The words poured out of her in a desperate flood. She had been controlled by my father, she explained. She had been afraid of what he would do if she defied him. She hadn't known how bad things would get, hadn't understood the full scope of his crimes, until it was too late to stop them. She had always loved me in her own way, even when her actions suggested otherwise. She was a victim, too, trapped in a marriage to a monster, forced to make impossible choices to survive. She talked about her own difficult childhood, about the pressures she had faced, about the fear that had governed her decisions for decades. She talked about regret and guilt, and sleepless nights spent wondering if she could have done things differently. She talked until her voice gave out, until the justifications and explanations and excuses finally exhausted themselves. Through all of it, I remained silent. When she finished, when the room fell quiet except for her ragged breathing and the distant sound of traffic outside, I finally spoke. "You chose yourself over your child." I said, my voice carrying no anger, no bitterness, only calm, clear truth. "Every single time for my entire life you chose the easier path instead of the right one. When Dad criticized me, you agreed with him rather than defending me. When Marissa tormented me, you laughed along rather than stopping her. When I lay on the floor at Christmas dinner, humiliated and in pain, you did nothing." She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued. "I understand fear. I understand survival. I understand what it means to feel trapped in circumstances that seem impossible to escape. I have compassion for the young woman you were when you married Dad, for the difficult position you found yourself in, for the pressure you experienced from people who should have protected you." I paused, letting the words settle. But understanding isn't forgiveness, and it doesn't erase 30 years of choosing everyone else over me. You had opportunities, hundreds of them, to be my mother instead of my abuser's accomplice. You had moments when a single word of defense, a single act of protection could have changed everything. You chose silence every time. You chose comfort. You chose the path that kept you safe while leaving me exposed. Tears were streaming down her face now, but I felt no impulse to comfort her. "I am not responsible for healing your guilt." I continued. "That work belongs to you, with therapists, with your faith, if you have one, with whatever internal process allows you to live with what you've done. I am only responsible for protecting myself. And protecting myself means we're done." Her sob was sharp wounded. "Shelby, please." Not because I hate you, I said quietly. I don't hate you. Hating you would mean you still have power over my emotions and you don't. We're done because I finally love myself enough to walk away. Because I've learned that family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by how people treat you. And you never treated me like family. I stood straightening my jacket with deliberate calm. I won't testify against you at your trial. I won't seek additional charges or push for harsher sentencing. The legal system will determine appropriate consequences for your involvement, and I'll accept whatever verdict is reached. But I also won't testify on your behalf. I won't write letters to the judge asking for leniency. I won't participate in your defense in any way. I walked toward the door, feeling her eyes on my back. All financial and emotional ties between us are permanently severed. You are not my mother anymore, not in any way that matters. I wish you whatever peace you can find, but you'll have to find it without me. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. Behind me, I heard her crying the raw, broken sound of someone who had finally lost something they never properly valued until it was gone. I didn't turn around. I didn't offer empty comfort or meaningless gestures of connection. I simply walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from the house where I had grown up. As I pulled onto the main road, I waited for the tears that had accompanied so many of my family interactions over the years. They didn't come. I waited for the guilt, for the second-guessing, for the familiar voice in my head telling me I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too much. Instead, I felt peace. The calm that had carried me through the conversation wasn't numbness or emotional suppression. It was genuine freedom, the settled certainty of someone who had finally released a burden she had carried her entire life. I no longer needed my mother's love, my father's approval, or my family's acknowledgement of my worth. I had proven my value to myself, and that was enough. Shelby walked out of her childhood home for the last time feeling lighter than she had in years. The past was finally behind her. Now the only question remaining was, what did she want her future to look like? The trials concluded 6 months later, bringing legal closure to the nightmare that had consumed my family for generations. My father received a sentence of 18 years in federal prison. The charges: conspiracy to cause serious bodily harm, insurance fraud, identity theft, and racketeering had accumulated into something the judge described as a systematic pattern of predatory behavior against his own family members. His attorneys argued for leniency based on his age and lack of prior criminal record, but the evidence of deliberate planning and complete absence of remorse convinced the court that significant incarceration was necessary. He would be in his 80s before becoming eligible for parole. My mother received probation and community service, her role characterized as complicity rather than leadership. The prosecution acknowledged that she had been dominated by her husband, manipulated into participating in crimes she might not have initiated herself, but they also noted that she had failed to protect her daughter, had actively participated in covering up crimes, and had chosen self-preservation over basic parental responsibility. She would spend the next 5 years reporting to a probation officer, completing hundreds of hours of community service, and living with the permanent stain of a felony conviction. I followed the proceedings from Texas, receiving updates from Margaret Chen and occasionally from Detective Morrison. I didn't attend the sentencing hearings. I had said everything I needed to say, and watching my parents receive their punishment held no appeal. Justice was happening. I didn't need to witness every moment of it. Life settled into something approaching normalcy. The company I had built from my father's ashes was thriving, employing dozens of people who had overcome their own traumas and were dedicated to helping others do the same. Dr. Hayes and I had developed a genuine friendship, meeting regularly for coffee and conversation, sharing stories about my grandmother that helped me understand the woman she had been before I knew her. Mr. Davis had become something like a surrogate grandfather, stopping by whenever he visited relatives in Texas, always bringing cookies and quiet wisdom. I was beginning to believe the hardest part was over when the knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached cautiously, checking the peephole before opening. The face I saw made me freeze. Marissa stood on my doorstep. She looked nothing like the sister I had known my entire life. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a plain sweater that looked like they had been purchased at a thrift store. Her face was bare of the makeup she had once applied with religious dedication, revealing lines and shadows that hadn't been visible beneath her carefully constructed facade. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Most striking was the exhaustion in her eyes, not the temporary fatigue of a sleepless night, but something deeper. Something that seemed to have settled permanently into her features. I opened the door but didn't invite her inside. We stood facing each other across the threshold, two sisters who had never been allowed to be sisters meeting honestly for perhaps the first time in our lives. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said quickly, as though anticipating my suspicion. "I'm not asking for money or forgiveness or another chance at your company. I just needed to say some things and then I'll go." I remained silent, waiting. She took a deep breath, her hands twisting together nervously. "I've been in therapy for 4 months. Real therapy, not the performative kind I used to brag about to friends. I'm working with someone who specializes in family dysfunction and complex trauma. It's been..." She paused, searching for words. "It's been brutal, actually. Learning to see myself clearly, understanding how I became the person I was." I watched her struggle, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't fully name. "I'm beginning to understand things," she continued. "About Dad, about how he manipulated everyone, about why I was so desperate to earn his approval, even though he was never going to give it. About what I did to you and why. It doesn't excuse anything. My therapist has been very clear about that. Understanding the reasons behind my choices doesn't erase the harm those choices caused." She met my eyes directly, something she had rarely done throughout our lives, without contempt or mockery in her gaze. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I haven't earned that, and I might never earn it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. Grandma was right to love you the way she did. You were always the strong one, Shelby. The real one. You had integrity I spent my whole life trying to destroy because I didn't have any of my own." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "I was so busy trying to steal what you had, Dad's approval. Grandma's respect, any sense of belonging, that I never tried to build something of my own. I tore you down because building myself up seemed impossible. I hurt you because hurting you was easier than facing my own emptiness." She fell silent, having said what she came to say. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't attempt any manipulation. She simply stood there waiting for whatever response I chose to give. I considered my words carefully before speaking. "I appreciate you telling me this," I said. "I can see that you're doing difficult work, and I respect that. It takes courage to face the truth about yourself, especially when that truth is ugly." She nodded, accepting the acknowledgement, without expectation of more. "I hope you find healing, Marissa. I genuinely do. I hope therapy helps you understand yourself, helps you build a life that doesn't depend on tearing down others. I hope you find peace." I paused, ensuring she understood what came next was final. "But you'll have to find it away from me. We're not going to be close. We're not going to rebuild a relationship or become the sisters we never were. Too much happened between us, and some damage can't be repaired, only accepted. I wish you well, but this is goodbye." She absorbed my words without argument, without protest, without the manipulation I had learned to expect from every interaction with her. She simply nodded once, a gesture of acceptance rather than agreement. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for listening." She turned and walked down the path from my door, her shoulders straight, her pace steady. She didn't look back. She didn't pause, hoping I would call her name. She simply left, accepting the boundary I had established with a dignity I had never seen from her before. I watched until she disappeared around the corner, then slowly closed the door. What I felt wasn't satisfaction or vindication. It wasn't anger or grief. It was something quieter, something like release, the sensation of a final thread being cut, the last connection to my family's dysfunction, finally severed. Shelby closed the door on her past and turned toward her future. The healing she needed now was just for herself, and for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. The months following Marissa's visit brought a peace I had never experienced before. With every tie to my former family severed, I found myself free to build a life that was entirely my own, shaped not by their expectations or cruelty, but by my own choices and desires. I made a decision that surprised even me. I moved into my grandmother's house. The property had been part of her estate, maintained by a service Patricia Thornton had arranged during the years between Eleanor's death and my inheritance. It was a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, nothing like the impressive house where I had grown up. But from the moment I walked through the door, I understood why my grandmother had loved it. The space felt warm, welcoming, filled with a presence that seemed to linger even years after her passing. I spent weeks sorting through Eleanor's remaining belongings, discovering pieces of a woman I had never fully known. Her journals revealed a mind that was sharp and curious until the very end, filled with observations about books she was reading, thoughts about the world, and frequent mentions of her worry for me. Photographs showed her at various ages, a striking young woman with determined eyes, a graceful middle-aged professional, a silver-haired elder whose smile carried both wisdom and sadness. In a cedar chest tucked away in her bedroom closet, I found the letters. Hundreds of them, spanning 50 years, exchanged between my grandmother and Dr. Hayes. I sat on her bedroom floor for an entire afternoon reading through correspondence that documented a love story I had only glimpsed through fragments and hints. They had written to each other consistently across decades, through marriages and careers, through children and grandchildren, through illnesses and losses, and all the ordinary struggles of long lives lived separately. The letters revealed what real love looked like. Not the passionate declarations of youth, though those were present in the earliest correspondence. Something deeper emerged over time. Patient attention to each other's lives, consistent presence even across distance, selfless concern for each other's happiness, even when that happiness existed apart from themselves. They had loved each other without possession, without demands, without the manipulation I had witnessed in my parents' relationship. Reading those letters, I began to understand where my own capacity for love might come from. Dr. Hayes became a regular presence in my new life. He visited often, sometimes bringing groceries or flowers, other times simply appearing on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and an afternoon to spare. Our conversations ranged widely: medicine and business philosophy, and gossip memories of Eleanor and plans for the future. He told me stories about my grandmother as a young woman, how brilliant she had been, how stubborn when she believed in something, how full of dreams that her era and circumstances had only partially allowed her to pursue. He described their youthful romance with tenderness, untarnished by decades, explained the family pressures that had separated them, and spoke of the strange comfort they had found in maintaining connection through letters even as they built separate lives. "She saw herself in you," he told me one afternoon. "The determination, the integrity, the refusal to accept unfairness, even when fighting seemed hopeless. She knew you had her strength, and she trusted that strength would carry you through whatever your family did." Through his eyes, I began to see myself differently, not as the family failure I had been trained to believe I was, the awkward sister, the disappointing daughter, the victim who couldn't fight back. I was the embodiment of everything my grandmother had valued: honesty, resilience, the courage to pursue justice, even when the cost was high. Our friendship deepened gradually, naturally, in ways that felt organic rather than forced. Mutual respect became genuine affection. Affection became something warmer, something that made me look forward to his visits with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I noticed when he was absent, found myself saving observations to share with him, caught myself smiling when I heard his car in the driveway. I wasn't sure what to call what was developing between us. Romance seemed too simple a word for something built on shared grief, mutual admiration, and connection to a woman we had both loved. But something was growing, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to let it. Beyond my relationship with Dr. Hayes, I began reclaiming parts of myself I had abandoned after my accident and during my years of family dysfunction. I had once loved painting watercolors, mostly quiet landscapes that required patience and attention. I set up a small studio in Eleanor's spare room and began creating again, finding that the meditative focus helped quiet the anxious thoughts that had plagued me for years. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during my family's crisis, reaching out with apologies for my absence and genuine interest in their lives. Most responded with warmth and understanding, welcoming me back into relationships I had feared were permanently damaged. Most significantly, I approached my physical recovery with new determination. I found a physical therapist who specialized in nerve damage cases, someone who pushed me past limitations I had accepted as permanent. The work was painful and slow, but I began to see improvement I hadn't believed possible. My reliance on the crutch decreased. My stamina increased. My body, which I had viewed as broken and unreliable, revealed capacities I had never explored. I was building the family I chose, having been freed from the family I was given. Mr. Davis remained a steady presence, visiting whenever he could, bringing wisdom and warmth that felt grandfatherly in the best sense. Staff members from my company became friends, people who knew my story and valued me anyway. I cultivated relationships built on honesty and mutual respect, surrounding myself with people who saw me clearly and appreciated what they saw. One evening, as we sat on Eleanor's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Dr. Hayes turned to me with a question in his eyes. The light caught the silver in his hair, and I noticed how comfortable he looked in this space that had belonged to the woman he had loved for half a century. "Eleanor used to say that the best things in life are worth waiting for," he said softly. I'm beginning to believe she was right. The invitation arrived on a December morning, elegant cream paper, requesting my presence at a winter charity gala benefiting people with disabilities. A year ago, I would have declined without hesitation, uncomfortable with attention, afraid of judgment, certain that I didn't belong in spaces meant for confident, whole people. Now I read the invitation and smiled. Dr. Hayes had arranged everything, of course. The event supported organizations that helped people rebuild their lives after serious injuries, and he wanted me to see the community that existed beyond my personal struggle. More than that, I suspected he wanted to share an evening that mattered to him with someone who had come to matter as well. I chose my dress carefully deep blue silk that moved gracefully when I walked, elegant, without being ostentatious. I selected it for my own pleasure rather than anyone else's approval, a small act of self-determination that would have seemed impossible a year ago. The gala sparkled with crystal chandeliers and candlelight filled with people whose stories of resilience matched or exceeded my own. I listened to speakers describe transforming their pain into purpose-building careers and families and meaningful lives despite circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. Their words resonated with everything I had experienced and everything I hoped to become. When Dr. Hayes led me to the dance floor for a slow waltz, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Not the anxious satisfaction of meeting someone else's expectations, not the brief relief of avoiding criticism. True happiness arising from within, belonging entirely to me. Later that evening, I found a quiet corner and pulled out the letter I had written earlier that day. Addressed to my parents but never intended for delivery, it contained everything I needed to say, not to them but to myself. I acknowledged what they had done without minimizing or excusing it. The fraud and manipulation, the emotional abuse that had shaped my entire childhood, the conspiracy that had broken my body and nearly destroyed my spirit. I named their crimes, clearly refusing to soften the truth for comfort's sake. I released my anger without offering forgiveness they hadn't earned. Their choices were their own, made deliberately and repeatedly over decades. My healing did not depend on their redemption, their apologies, or their understanding of what they had done. I was free, whether they ever changed or not. I stepped onto a small balcony and lit the corner of the letter with a candle flame. The paper curled and blackened, words disappearing into smoke that rose toward the winter stars. I watched until nothing remained but ash, feeling the weight of decades lifting with each fragment that floated away. Some things don't need to be said to the people who hurt you. Some things only need to be said to yourself. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. Frost covered the grass, and my breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Dr. Hayes had offered to accompany me, but I asked him to wait by the car. This moment needed to be private. I placed flowers against the headstone, winter roses her favorites, and knelt in the frozen grass. "You saved me, Grandma," I said softly. "Even after you were gone, you were still fighting for me. I understand now why you did it the way you did. You knew I needed to find my own strength before I could use the weapons you left behind." The morning was silent except for distant birdsong and the whisper of wind through bare branches. I found it. I used them. And I'm going to be okay. I touched the headstone gently, feeling connection rather than loss. She had loved me fiercely, prepared for me meticulously, and trusted me completely. That love had outlasted her death, reaching across years to protect me when I needed it most. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything." I stood slowly, brushing frost from my knees, and turned toward the path where Dr. Hayes waited at a respectful distance. He stood beside the car patient, and steady, a man who had loved my grandmother for 50 years and was now perhaps beginning to love me. I walked toward him, toward the life I was finally ready to build. The past lay behind me, acknowledged, processed, released. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but no longer frightening. For the first time in her life, Shelby's story truly belonged to her, and somewhere she knew her grandmother was smiling. Shelby's journey reminds us that the people who are supposed to love us the most can sometimes hurt us the deepest. But it also proves that strength, patience, and the courage to fight for yourself can transform even the darkest betrayal into a story of triumph. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful tale of resilience and justice. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up against people who underestimated you? Do you believe Shelby made the right choice by refusing to forgive her family? Share your thoughts and experiences with our community. Your stories matter to us, and who knows, your comment might inspire our next video. Thank you for watching until the end.